Japanimation Station.
Hello and welcome to Japanimation Station, an anime podcast brought to you by the folks at the Weekly Stuff Podcast. I am Sean Chapman.
And I'm Jonathan Lack.
And we are here once again to dive into the wild and wacky world of anime. This week on the show, we have a very exciting episode because we are covering Fate Zero. Last week, we dipped our toes into Fate Zero by just talking about the special double-length premiere, but you, Jonathan, have now seen all of Fate Zero, so we'll be talking about episodes 2 to 25 to be very specific on this episode. It is an amazing show. This is maybe the fifth time I think I've watched it. I was trying to figure out how many times I've actually watched this show at this point. It's enough that I cannot remember how many times. It is amazing every time I've watched it, but Jonathan, this is the first time for you, so how's it going? How'd you feel? Fate Zero.
Oh my god, this is an absolute masterpiece of a show. It's incredible. And I have no pre-existing connection to Fate Stay Night, as we talked about last week. So I have now seen Garden of Sinners. I'm currently reading Witch on the Holy Night, the visual novel. So I've seen some other stuff in the Kinoko Nasu verse, but I have not read Fate Stay Night. I did not know anything about the Holy Grail War or any of that stuff, or the servants and the masters or the mages, any of that kind of, lore of the Fate Stay Night universe. I would not really, before this season, have been able to tell you what broad genre Fate Stay Night was, other than it looked vaguely fantasy. And even now, after seeing this, I'm actually not sure what genre exactly you would put it into. It's kind of a battle show. It's high fantasy, but it's also modern day. There's so much going on in it. But I loved it. And it works, I think, 100% as an introduction to this universe. For me, at least, this being my first exposure. I could tell certain bits of this is prequelizing, but I think the only thing in the entire series where I would say it feels maybe a little diminished if you haven't seen the other stuff is the single episode focused on Rin Tosaka, who I know goes on to be the hero of one of the Fate Stay Night routes. And it's not a bad episode, it's just one where you go, okay, this one kind of counts on you having a pre-existing connection to this character. Other than that, I think this show works like absolute gangbusters. It makes me want to see more. But I also think it's such a good show on its own merits that if for whatever reason this is all Ufotable made, this was the only Fate show you could go watch, it would be a wholly satisfying experience. It's so fucking good. It's obviously a masterclass of TV animation, below the level of Garden of Sinners, just by virtue of this being a TV show and that being a movie, but having some moments that in the Ufotable tradition, you could put that in a movie theater and no one would bat an eyelash at, because it's incredible, like the big fight between Kotomine and Kiritsugu in the penultimate episode, which is one of the best things they've ever done. So yeah, it's an incredible, incredible show. I'm really excited to break it down. I raced through this thing. For those, just to peel back the curtain, we're recording this less than a week after we recorded the last one. And that's not like we were lying to you on the last one and I had seen more. No, we had only seen episode 1, and then we just raced through these other 24 episodes because they're that good. And I've been traveling and displaced. We are recording this one in Portland, Oregon for me. This is the third state I've recorded this season of Japanimation Station in, after Iowa and Colorado. 4 if you count Sean down in Texas. But I couldn't stop. I had to just ingest this show whole. It's amazing.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things I was struck with again watching it, was like, this is a show that, like, it takes a tremendous amount of willpower to choose to stop watching it. Like,
Yes.
having to say, I'm not going to move on to the next episode is taxing. I think, Jonathan, you probably now understand why I was like, there's no way we're splitting this conversation at the end of season 1, because it would have been like a crime to force you to stop watching the show at that point to record a podcast.
That would have been brutal for the people watching this when it was airing week to week, that like you get to the end of episode 13 and they're like, we'll see you in April, and it was December. Can you imagine waiting 4 months with the hype that episode 13 is the one that ends with Saber revealing that because of the Lady of the Lake, she can run across water, and she's running across water to go fight Castor, and then cut. We'll see you in April. That's a fucking mic drop. But no, this is one of the most propulsive shows I've ever seen. Like, it is off like a fucking bullet. We talked about the first episode last week, and it's obviously extremely propulsive and gives you a bunch of character and plot and all this stuff. But then basically, episode 2 is you have this big sort of deal with Assassin seemingly being killed, and there's some mystery around that. And then in episode 3, you have Saber meeting Lancer in the field of battle, and then Ryder shows up, and Archer shows up, and soon you have basically every servant in the series in one place before you even hit like episode 4. It's insane. And the show it basically doesn't breathe until I think you get to that Reen episode I mentioned earlier, is when you finally kind of take a break, and then after that is you have the Grail dialogue episode where you have Ryder invite everyone to talk about the Grail, and that's kind of the first time the show slows down. It is just off like a fucking bullet. It's crazy.
Yeah, the pacing of the show is incredible. You know, it's got a whole sort of ensemble structure to it, because it really is, you know, you have a viewpoint with every different camp with the masters and the servants, which is one of the main things that makes it very different than Fate Stay Night. That is going to be a thing that's more focused around kind of like the main characters, more kind of conventional point of view. But that ensemble thing allows it to have that propulsive feel where you're constantly jumping to, there's always something going on to, you know, so it's like whenever there's a down point in one character's story, you can just say, oh, but what is Waver and Ryder? What are they up to? Oh, what scheme is Kotomine like concocting right now? What the shit is Castor getting up to? So it's like you're always moving your point of view to where the story is most exciting, and then that allows, like, Kiritsugu gets to be in the background for a stretch of episodes, and then he gets to come back and do some of the most heinous shit you've ever seen a character ever do. And it is one of those things that, even though I have seen this show, again, maybe 5, maybe even 6 times, like, it is impossible to just be like, oh, I'm going to stop watching. Like, oh, I'm good. I don't need to move on to the next episode. The show's so well paced and it's so exciting that even knowing exactly what's going to happen and being able to like quote like lines to you and stuff about the show, I've seen it enough. I still am like so propelled through the whole show that it was very easy for me to keep pace with you on your first viewing, having to like chew it all up because it was all new for you. I was like, yeah, you texted me this like, oh, we could probably do the podcast a little bit earlier than we planned. And I'm like, yep, that will be very easy for me to accommodate.
Yes. No, totally. I mean, this week involved me having a couple of long flights, and I think one flight was 4 hours, and I watched 6 or 7 episodes on that flight, and it was just like, it just made the flight very enjoyable of just like, let's chew through these. This is because that was like the early stretch of episodes where you have that battle in the shipyard that I was talking about earlier, where you kind of get everyone together for the first time, and I'm just like, oh, this is stupidly good. Like, it does not have any kind of ramping up period of like, what's the kind of episodes you have to get through before it's just off to the races from basically the first moments of the first episode, and it does not let up. And even in the episodes that are quote unquote slower, you still have giant things happening. Like I say that episode where they Ryder invites everyone for the dialogue about the Holy Grail and what they want to do. That is a slower episode of the series, but it also involves the revealing of Ryder's big like ultra move and the killing of the first of the servants, Assassin. So like there are no actual slow episodes of this thing. It just moves consistently throughout up to one of the best home stretches of anime I've ever seen.
Yeah, I do think particularly the second, I mean, the whole show is amazing, but the second core or whatever, I would say like particularly from episode 15 basically to the end. Episode 15 is when Saber uses Excalibur for the first time. Like, yes. It's just, because that's when it starts like, oh, servants are starting to be killed off and the battlefield is narrowing toward it, you feel that it's heading towards its conclusion. Like, it is one of the most incredible stretches of episodes in any anime. It includes like the death of Diarmuid, which is an amazing episode, the 2 flashback episodes for Kiritsugu, then all the final confrontations between the characters. It's just like episode after episode, it is like, oh, this is one of the best episodes of a show I've ever seen. Like, it's one, and all of them are so memorable. And it's like kind of crazy, having seen the show before, going through and be like, oh my God, right, no, yeah, okay, we finished that episode. And then the next episode is like this episode that's super iconic that everybody who's seen the show knows super well and stuff like that. There's no point where it's like, oh, this is the kind of lower episode that, nobody ever talks about or whatever. Every episode has several moments that are, if you're a fan of this series, are like really iconic moments that people remember or talk about, do fan art of, like quote, all that kind of stuff. It's like the whole show is just like that constantly.
And I think the ensemble nature really, really helps with that. As you said, it's just that every set of characters you go to is interesting in their own way. You have ones that are maybe less like interesting, or it just not interesting is the right word, but like less obviously sympathetic, like Castor and Ryunosuke, the fucking serial killer dude, but they're still fascinating to cut to, and all the material with them is great, and obviously gives us kind of the season 1 to season 2 shift is the big action sequence around them. And then also the voice cast is just A-listers top to bottom, and so it's just incredible to hear all these actors bouncing off one another. In the way we've talked about with some other shows, it's not just incredible, it's almost like humbling to hear like, oh, Akio Otsuka is like, his name will show up like in the 3rd row of the credits, in the end credits, and it's one of the most impressive performances he's ever given, and that's fucking saying something because it's Akio Otsuka. So it's just, it's so stacked as a show, and it's always in motion. Yeah.
Yeah, and it has, like, I think one of the things that's super impressive is it has a really big cast, because, like, the nature of the Holy Grail War means that you have a bare minimum of 14 major characters you have to deal with, not counting any extra characters like Maya and Iris Feel and stuff like that as well. And so, some of those, like Berserker, obviously you don't have to, like, worry as much about on the voice. So that the couple of lines that he does have when he's kind of sane are very good. But in general, it is a very big cast of characters, and all of them are interesting. All of them are memorable. All of them serve really like vital purposes in the plot and for thematic reasons. And then, yes, like top to bottom, it's one of the most impressive voice casts, I think, in any anime, both by its pedigree, but also like in terms of the execution, that everyone brings their A game. They're all incredibly impressive performances. Some of them, like the guy, Rikiya Koyama, who plays Kiritsugu, he was originally cast based on, like, the last scene of Fate Zero, of him and this mysterious red-haired boy that we'll probably never see again. I don't know, he might pop up, having that conversation, like, looking up at the moon. That scene is from Fate Stay Night. So he was cast to voice that scene in the original Fate Stay Night anime, and that's it. He had like 5 lines of dialogue, but they obviously knew, we want to make sure that it's super important that those lines of dialogue land really hard. Let's cast someone like Rikiya Koyama who's like really fucking good, and that's what he was cast for. And they never recast the character when it became like, oh, he's the main character of this whole other show. And that's one of like the miracles of this cast, is that there are several characters like that actors that were cast to play relatively small roles in the original Fate Stay Night anime, and then they get these big, wholesome performances in their own show that's a prequel, and it's like everybody holds their own, and every performance is amazing, and it's just such a stacked cast of performances.
I was going to ask you about that because, one of the things I want to talk about here is that while this obviously is in the Kinoko Nasu verse, and, now I can tell you what magic circuits are and stuff, because I've seen this show and I've been playing Mahotsukai no Yoru, Witch on the Holy Night, which gets very deep into all of that too. Well, that's where that all comes from, actually. Yeah. And so, it's got all of those Nasu signatures, but it is Gen Urobuchi wrote this, and it does have, I think, a very different flavor than Garden of Sinners or Witch on the Holy Night or the other things we've talked about or will talk about. But it is funny when you make that transition in the final episode, basically around the time when the timer finally gets to 0, because that's the moment when Shiro's story starts. I'm like, oh, that's Kinoko Nasu dialogue. I haven't seen Fate Stay Night. I can just tell you that's very clearly Kinoko Nasu dialogue for the like final 10 minutes of this show. And I like that kind of connection there, because it's one of the cool things about this prequel, because I was reading about this and it seems like they gave Urobuchi like a lot of room to run with like making this his own, and I think he very much does. But then when it dovetails back into sort of the Nasu stuff, it's so cool to kind of see that all come together.
Yeah, because it is like, we kind of like alluded to this a little bit last time talking about Fate Zero and like what the visual novel is and stuff. But now that you've seen the show, it can like be more clear about specifically what is explained in Fate Stay Night is like Kiritsugu's overall role in the Holy Grail War, Saber's overall role in Kotomine and Gilgamesh. Like those are the characters that, like, particularly the stuff that happens at the end, all of that is very clearly detailed out in Fate Stay Night. So that's like the thing that is set in stone. That's like, it has to arrive at this point. Kiritsugu has to have this kind of general backstory, although they never give the specifics about the island and Shirley and all that. That's stuff that Urobuchi Gen filled in. But that he was like this kind of child soldier, assassin kind of person. So it's like those are the things that are very much set in stone, but everything else was stuff that he had to invent. So like all the details of those characters are basically invented. Kotomine is probably the character that is most set in stone from Fate Stay Night, because there's even more of his backstory that's in that visual novel than is even in Fate Zero. But then every other character, Ryder is a complete invention by Urobuchi Gen, and Waver Velvet is, and this Lancer and Kenneth Archibald, like all that stuff. Any other character is all an invention of Urobuchi Gen and purely made for Fate Zero. So it's like, while there are some things that are clearly set in stone, particularly near the end, most of this is really an Urobuchi Gen project, but him trying to replicate some of the stylistic things in Nasu's writing that gives it a very unique flavor. Like, he's not just trying to make an Urobuchi Gen like production on his own. He is very clearly trying to see and like emulate some of the general stylistic elements of Nasu while putting his own spin on it.
And I think that's just fun, because you've got two, amazing writers sort of dovetailing here, and you can see where the storytelling, sensibilities are different, and you can see where they're similar, but I love it. I think my favorite thing in this whole series is Waver, Velvet, and Ryder and their entire story. And it makes sense to me that is a sort of invention here, because it's one of the stories that it is unbound by any prequel considerations, right? Yeah. It's a story that they get, other than, they can't win, because that would be a different story. But other than that, they can do whatever they want with those characters. And I think and I actually was going to ask you, does Waver ever show up in Fate Stay Night, or is he a complete invention here?
So he is a complete invention here. But he's a hugely popular character, so he ends up showing up in other things later down the line. I will say that he will technically show up in something we're going to watch. I don't know if you will even realize it's him. I'll be curious to see if you will recognize when Waver pops up in a different thing we're going to watch.
Yeah. Well, because I love it, because that's the set of characters that wind up. This is a very dark story. It is an almost textbook tragedy, and I want to talk about this because there's the sense of tragedy we use when we talk about it in the news, like a natural disaster, that's tragic. But then there's the actual literary Shakespearean sense of tragedy, which is a different kind of thing. And this is that, like, writ large. It is a very good example of good literary tragic storytelling. And I think Waver and Ryder give you your sort of, like, kind of uplift and humanity at the end of this is someone who escapes the cycle. And I love that. And I think that's where Urobuchi Gen getting to invent his own stuff is great, because that gives you, this would be an extra depressing show if you did not have that to kind of like give you a little bit of a pressure valve release,
Yes, because obviously, it being a prequel does mean that, as is the case with many prequels, it has to have a very dark ending. Like, there's no way to write around what needs to happen at the end of this. To set up everything that happens in Fate Stay Night. So it's like Saber's story is incredibly depressing in Fate Zero. It's the thing that, as a fan of that character from Fate Stay Night, is always really hard to watch this show from that perspective, because she's just like, her ending is so upsettingly dark. Kiritsugu's ending has to like generally be dark, though there is the single ray of light that happens for a character that we might see again. Who knows? Little red-haired boy. But yes,
again, I knew who Shiro Emiya was coming into this.
Yeah.
It's hard not to know the design of the red-haired boy from Fate Stay Night. He shows up places like Saber. I was aware of him.
Yes, yeah, it's very clear that he's the protagonist of Fate Stay Night. So it's like there's a little ray of hope at the end, but it's like, man, this shit has to end very dark. And so yes, Waver gets to be like the most this show has in terms of like comic relief is basically what Waver can provide, which is refreshing. But he also gets to survive the war and go on, and then eventually get his own spin-offs and stuff if you want to explore the wider world. Like it is one of the fun things about Fate Zero is that he gets to escape the gravity of this tragic story.
But man, it's so good. I love this show. I'm so excited to talk about it today. We've already done like 20 minutes of just intro thoughts because it's that kind of good. Where do you want to dive in deeper with this, Sean? We have a lot of possibilities before us.
Yeah, like I think that's the thing is like, how do we want to tackle the show? Because I think there's so much going on in it. I think you can either we can run through kind of the arcs of like the episodes, or we can like maybe run down the characters, because I think those are kind of the two main ways to approach tackling the show.
I think characters might be the most productive way to do it, just because of how they kind of all interweave. And that I feel like if we were going to talk about like the Waver and Rider stuff, for instance, in the early going, I would have to start talking about the ending, So I think we should do it that way.
Okay. So which characters do you want to try to do a deep dive onto first?
I guess I'll just say Waver and Rider because like they are my favorite part of this show. I think it's so, and that is not to denigrate any other part of this show. It's just the thing that if you listened to last week's episode, you heard like that Waver kid comes off as such a shithead in the first episode of Fate Zero, right? He is this punk little mage kid who thinks he's better than everyone, and his literal, like, obviously his goal is much less hot-headed than some of the other people coming into this war who want to do much worse things, but he basically does all of this just because he wants to prove to his jerk teachers that he's as good as he thinks he is, right? And so he steals this relic, and he gets this hero, and he got way more than he bargained for, but also kind of exactly what he needed, because he gets Iskander, Alexander the Great, as Rider, as voiced by Akio Otsuka, who is the biggest personality in the entire show, and just the most kind of cool, loving, but also like subtly complex character. I think one of the main themes of this entire show is obviously kind of breaking down and breaking apart myths of heroism and chivalry and things like that. And I think one of the most interesting trajectories of that is with Rider, which is kind of the most forefront, like, affirmation of the goodness of some of those ideals, but with a character who does lose in the end. But through this whole experience, Waver actually kind of becomes a human being. Like, he actually kind of like grows into something where he escapes this cycle, he finds a family, he decides, I think fairly clearly, he's not going to be going back to mage school with all those jerks. He has gotten out of this. And I think just that it is comedy. Obviously, there's lots of laughs. You've got Ryder walking around with his shirt from the video game he bought. And you've got, him wanting to, he's like, I bought the console too. Don't worry. We'll play it together when we get home. I even got an extra controller. And you've got all of that. And then, of course, it will come back around at the end, and Waver goes home after Ryder has died, and he finds an extra shirt that was with the special edition and the console there waiting for him, and that's what broke me in the finale, is like I teared up a little bit at that. It's incredible, and I think that range of emotions that is shown there, from this being the comic relief to also, I think, kind of the ultimate sign of humanity in this series, is one of the coolest things to me about it.
Yeah, it's a really powerful story arc, and I think obviously like one of the big things that stands out about it is Iskander. He's like Iskander is my favorite Akio Otsuka performance. Like it has always been since I've seen this, like, and rewatching it has just like affirmed that for me. It's like such an incredible performance, because the character has to be so much larger than life, because he is making himself larger than life, right? He is the king of conquerors. He needs to be this like leader amongst leaders. It's Alexander the Great, the man who conquered like what was to him most of the known world. And I think one of the great things about Fate, and one of the things that attracted me to this franchise in general, was its treatment of like mythological slash, in this case, obviously more specifically historical, but historical person who has been so mythologized. But that treatment of myth and legend in Fate I find so interesting because obviously a big theme in the franchise is this contrast of modern people and specifically these like mages and stuff with these heroes of myth and legend. And this vision of Alexander the Great being this person who like lives to life's greatest extremes, right? That's kind of like what he says is like, you know, whether it's like booze or fighting or sex or whatever, like you have to take the most pleasure you can in everything that you do in life. And you must push everything to your extremes because he is this symbol for all of his men that he leads them forward. And that is why they become his noble phantasm. Like that's just such an interesting way of grasping at, I think, like a core of the legend of Alexander the Great and pulling it forward into this story is this man who just like, you know, Alexander, the real Alexander the Great, as they kind of bring up in here as well, he died very young. He died in his early 30s. But he accomplished this like unbelievable feat. And I think like the characterization to sort of like recognize that being this person who must push everything to its limits is really interesting, and what that then does for Waver, who then is this kind of cowed, sort of very sheepish, anxiety-ridden young man, having to sort of like learning how to emulate some of that and become his retainer at the end. It's a very powerful story.
It's beautiful, and you know, as funny as it is often very funny. Pretty much any scene of comedy with the two of them has this kind of extra layer of drama and pathos to it. You know, so much of the early stuff of Ryder going around and getting a feel for the world and buying his cool t-shirt and getting his jeans and all of that, right? It's very funny, but it's also in the moment, and then when they recast some of it later on in flashback that you get when Waver is kind of putting it all together, of like, you know, one of the first things Ryder does is see a map and see like, oh, this is the world, and it was so much bigger than I thought it was. But also it was closed. There was no Oceanus. There was no infinite ocean, you know? And so it kind of scrambles his brain a little bit. But then also, what is the wish he has? It's maybe the smallest wish anyone has, which is he just wants another lifetime in this life. Because he wants to explore and be great. And he talks about ruling the world, but for him, ruling the world means something so abstract from what everyone else says. Like Gilgamesh wants to rule the world, but that's because he views literally everything as his possession. He has ownership over it, right? And Ryder's is like, and they even talk about this with others. He would go through and plant his flag and then leave. Like, you guys do this? I'm ruling just means I've passed through and I've seen it and I've experienced this. And he just wants those experiences. And of course, what that casts on Waver over time is how little experience he has had. And that, you know, his ending to be, I'm going to go out and see the world and see actual humanity is something that's so beautiful. And in this, of course, we can't forget, you have Akio Otsuka giving the performance of a fucking lifetime from one of the undisputed all-time greats. But then you have Daisuke Namikawa doing Waver Velvet. And we have talked about Daisuke Namikawa many times on Weekly Suit Gundam and Japanimation Station, and we will many more times in the future. Wonderful actor and a wonderful performance that can hit that mix of comedy and the cowed nature of the character, but then slowly, that's my dog, pull back some layers and see the humanity underlying this person, and then also, and the complexity underlying him. And then I think when you get to the final episodes, the grief and everything he's able to play and all of that, it's a great, you know, that's what Daisuke Namikawa is good at, and it's beautiful.
Yeah, and I've always found it a very interesting piece of casting because it feels like it's outside of his normal range of characters you'd expect him to play, because he's having to really transform his voice a lot to play Waver. Like it feels like a role he would be more suited to play when he was more of a child actor rather than, you know, like 40 or something, however old he was when he actually played Waver. Because it's something where there are some things where there's a show that's a spin-off of Fate that called Lord El Meloy's Case Files, that grown-up Waver is the main character in that show. Not to get into all that into too much detail, but the older version of Waver is a much more normal Namikawa Daisuke performance, and it's much more like normally set in his voice. And I've just always found it interesting that it feels like I don't know how much of that was intentional, but it feels very effective for the performance that, like, there is something awkward about Waver's whole voice. And his, like, behavior and his, like, the physicality of the character reinforces that, and that he's so wants to be the person that he's eventually going to grow up to be. But he's not there yet. He still needs to grow up, but he just desperately wants to be that adult. And I think there's something about casting Namikawa Daisuke, who is so suited to play the cool adult version of Waver, but you never see that character here. You know, there's no flash forward or something where you see adult Waver who's very confident and he's an experienced mage and all that stuff. That never happens. You only ever get little kid Waver in Namikawa Daisuke's performance of little kid Waver. I mean, he wouldn't even get to play the older version of the character for like several years past this point. So it's like such a fascinating piece of casting, because it almost feels like it's like conceptual casting in a way of like you're pulling this actor a little bit out of his comfort zone, or at least like the comfort zone that the audience would normally have listening to him, to, I think, represent something about the awkwardness and the sort of evolving nature of Waver as a person, that he's in this very awkward stage in his life.
I love that. I love that you can hear young Namikawa Daisuke as a child actor, things like War in the Pocket. You can hear resonances of it, but you can also see where the character is pulling in that other direction. I mean, yeah, because this would have come out like around the time when he takes over as Goemon Ishikawa in Lupin, which is like one of his most like cool, badass, deep-voiced performances. And it is an amazing back and forth. I've been watching a bunch of Lupin stuff from this period recently, and it's fun to go back and forth between these two. And yeah, just that dynamic the two of them have together, I love it so much. Obviously, Ryder gets to do amazing, cool things in battle, but it's just the voice just comes through so strong, and you do get that standout episode, the Grail dialogue, where they all come together at the Einsburn Castle, and they're pouring wine, and then of course, you know, Archer comes with his better wine because he's an asshole, and they are all talking about what they want out of the Grail. And I think there's like two key turning points for me in the show's discussion of like heroism and chivalry, because in the early stages of this show, and I think throughout, one of the great pleasures of Fate Zero, and I assume this is true in other parts of the Fate universe, is like having these heroes come together, and they're all larger than life personalities, and they have these codes of honor and chivalry. And so when you have Saber and Lancer, which we'll get to in a little bit because that's one of the thorniest parts of the show, but when you have them being the first combatants to meet, and they immediately are sort of friendly because they recognize each other's skill and they want to have a good, honorable battle, that's one of the things that that's so fun to see in this show, right? It's like, oh, cool. It's like it's this honorable battle where there's violence, but everyone involved is like upstanding, and Ryder will come in and be like, and I respect you too. And you love that kind of the chivalry of it that you love in like, you know, old sort of like, you know, stories about knights and all of that kind of stuff, right? And you get that here. And then I think there are two key turning points. There is obviously later in the show when Kiritsugu does one of the worst things anyone's ever done in an anime to Lancer and his masters, and then has this dialogue with Saber about it that we are going to break down in detail because it's one of the most amazing pieces of writing in the show. But I also think you have this, where you have Saber and Ryder together, and so you have Alexander the Great and King Arthur. And I think in the popular consciousness, you would think of King Arthur as the ultimate king. You would think of that character as like, well, that's the person who saved Britain and brought the Knights of the Round Table together. And if anyone, you know, can invoke chivalry and those kinds of ideas of the honorable knight in our public imagination, it's going to be the Arthur character. And Alexander says, you were never even a king, and gives this whole explanation of what that means. And it's fascinating. It's kind of brain-bending because it's not a perspective you would have thought of before. And from that point on, obviously, it gives Saber this crisis of conscience, but it also casts Ryder in an entirely different light. And all of the future stuff around heroism and chivalry, the audience is going to read through a different prism. And I think those two, you know, turning points just make this work so much richer as it goes along.
Yeah, well, I think in particular, there's like 3 episodes there that to me are like the kind of 3 of the key episodes, particularly for like this set of characters, Ryder, Archer, and Saber, which is the Banquet of Kings episode 11, which is the most famous episode from the show. Like it's super quoted all the time and stuff, because it's a really central episode and it's very effective. But it's the Excalibur episode, because that is where Saber gets to in her own way, give her retort to Ryder, right? Her having Excalibur and what Excalibur represents is a direct, refusal of what Ryder is kind of bringing forward of his perspective of what it is to be a king. And then you have Kiritsugu's ultimate sort of response to all of this, which is in the Dear Mood episode, episode 16. But I think Ryder's role in that kind of like set of this, you have your three king characters. You have the King of Heroes, Gilgamesh. You have the King of Knights, King Arthur, Artoria, Pendragon, Saber, whichever name you want to refer to her by. And then you have Iskander or Alexander the Great, the King of Conquerors. And, Iskander's perspective is that a king is someone who leads other people. Gilgamesh's perspective is that a king is somebody who rules other people, right? He is a king because he is the king, and whatever anybody else does is whatever. He lives for his own pleasure, and everybody should obey him because his word is law, his whim is law, but because he is the biggest and baddest motherfucker around, that's just the way it is. All the world's treasures are his because that's just how it is. But then Saber, or King Arthur, doesn't lead and doesn't rule. She serves her people, right? And that's her perspective. And that's like a much more modern perspective, although it also has a lot of parallels to actual medieval philosophy around what a monarch is meant to be, even though we obviously know that historically speaking, monarchs never really behaved that way. The thought was that they were meant to serve the country and serve the people, that was part of the point of the royal we, is that they were an embodiment of the country and the people who lived there. But I think Iskander's perspective is that the king is someone who leads his people and inspires them to move forward and to dream greater dreams and to like invest their dreams and their hopes and their ambitions into the king. And the king drives that forward is really compelling, and it's very like intoxicating almost. And he offers that at the Banquet of Kings. But I think one thing that's interesting about the character, and this ties into his demise at the hands of Gilgamesh, that Gilgamesh, tells him, I'm going to wake you from this dream of yours. And that's what he does, is that ultimately, like, Alexander the Great accomplished very little, right? He led his men and he conquered so much territory, and he went very far, but there was nothing he was ever trying to accomplish. There's nothing he was ever trying to like protect, nothing he was trying to serve. He had no like ideal to achieve. It was just to lead people somewhere. His conquering wasn't about trying to defeat enemies, and his conquering wasn't really about trying to expand his territory. And I'm staying more for this Iskander, less the historical Alexander the Great. Don't want to conflate that too much. But it's like, it was not about him controlling as much land as possible. He just wanted to keep conquering going forward to eventually reach Oceanus and what that like represented to him. But that was all fruitless, right? It didn't accomplish anything in the long term. It means that his life and his experiences, and he grew and he's powerful. And I think that's part of what he imparts onto Waver, is the sense of like his own growth and his own confidence and his own self-worth, because it's all what all that sort of journey of self-improvement that his conquering was about, like, achieves and imparts onto Waver. But like, what did that achieve for anybody else, right? And I think that's like the question for Iskander and for like the viewer to consider across these three different viewpoints. Is like, what is the long-standing achievement of Alexander the Great, and what worth would there be for anybody other than himself were he to achieve the Holy Grail and be reincarnated once again into the world?
Oh, exactly. Yeah. And I think, because you're right, it is I talked about the two turning points, but you're right. It is the three overall perspectives of the three kings. And I think it is such an interesting dialogue because it does so embody kind of three ideas of leadership that do survive, onto today. Mm-hmm. This is, for instance, the Netflix series, The Crown, which is about, the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. So very modern times. It very much, it doesn't ever have a scene where, she sits down with the three other larger than life heroes and hashes this out. But it is very much about those like different, roughly the conqueror, the leader, or the conqueror / leader, the, ruler and the servant, and kind of like bouncing between those perspectives. And does the crown today serve any of those, actually, is like kind of the driving question of the show. And so these are all, very modern live issues. And I think it's interesting how the show doesn't, I don't think, land on any one of them being right. It lands the closest on Gilgamesh being wrong. maybe because he's the bad guy. But like, you see because as much as like that's true what you said about Ryder and Alexander the Great, it is also true that like one of the most fulsome, clear character transformations we see does come in Waver as a result of meeting this person and learning these lessons. So like there is value to, I think, these different perspectives. And of course, Arthur is absolutely tortured by this, but she's also in many ways the most noble and self-sacrificing. And of course, these are things that we think of as good. And I think questioning the goodness and the worth of those is such an interesting perspective to take that I would not have expected in a show with a, this King Arthur figure at the center of it, because it's so kind of zigs where you expect it to zag in that analysis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Because I do think it is meant to especially undercut your preconceived notions about King Arthur, like top to bottom, right? Like including like the gender of the character and everything that goes with that. But like I do think and this is I think something that is more apparent on repeated viewings is one thing I find interesting is how much Ryder misreads Saber. That I think he doesn't fully understand. I think he misunderstands her the way that everybody misunderstands her.
Right.
Because he just sees this beautiful young girl that knows nothing of the world, when it's like, well, actually, Saber is like 35 or something. She's young because the magic of Avalon keeps her young, eternally youthful. She's the same age physically she was when she pulled out the sword and the stone. But everybody sees her as boyish because she's hiding her gender. Ryder understands that she's a woman, but he is like sort of so preoccupied by that I think he fails to see that there is like a larger good that is served by the things that Saber does. In some ways that maybe even terrifies him, because like the good that he imparts is so limited. It's limited to himself and the people that directly follow him, but there's not anything larger that he's accomplishing, because accomplishing something larger like that requires him to put aside those immediate things that he wants and those immediate like goals that he has. Those are all the things that Saber has sacrificed to serve her people. And he's like, I can't do that, because how can I live my own life if I'm putting aside all those things in order to serve other people? That's part of his perspective of the king, is like, you have to live the most, because that is like that is how you're going to inspire people. But it also like ignores the experiences of people like Kiritsugu, who are the normal people who live in this world, that are all the people who lived in those towns that he's going around and conquering in order to go to Oceanus. Like Kiritsugu is the voice for those kinds of people, right? That's something that this show doesn't zoom in on very specifically, but it's part of like the overall thematic construction, as you see, that's like behind the glory of the conquest that he embodies, that it feels so intoxicating and powerful, that there are all these people left behind that have to pick up those pieces and whose lives are destroyed as he's working his way to Oceanus.
Right. Yeah. It's all complicated. That's one of the things that's great about this show.
Yes. Is
it has these big moments of soaring emotion, but it's always tempered by really thorny issues that it's getting you to think about. And I think this is absolutely one of them. But before we move away from Ryder and Waver to some of these other characters, I do just want to talk about a few other scenes. Like one of the most, I think, surprising scenes of this entire series to me is the scene where Waver gets up on the roof with his fake grandpa. Where because he has this old man and woman in Japan, in Fuyuki City, that he has hypnotized into thinking that he is their grandson. And the grandpa invites him up on the roof, and Waver gets up there and reveals that he knows that Waver is not their actual grandson. The hypnosis wore off, or never worked, or whatever. But he always had this dream of sitting up on the roof with his grandchildren. That's why they built this house in this place in Fuyuki City, and look at this amazing view. And he said, and then he reveals, and our grandchildren never did this with us. It's very sad. But Waver is doing it, and Waver has this little connection. And it is such a beautiful moment of very small humanity. You know, what it reminded me of, what I wrote down in my notes is, this reminds me of the scene in Spider-Man 2, where Peter has the cake and milk with the girl across the hall. Of just this tiny, it's one of those scenes that I think when I was a kid, I didn't quite get in Spider-Man 2. And the older I get, the more I'm like, this is like the masterstroke of the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy, is this little scene that they took 5 minutes in this giant Hollywood blockbuster to just have Peter sit and imagine a simple, seemingly meaningless, but in its meaninglessness, very meaningful life, you know? If we connect it to Garden of Sinners, it's that whole idea in the Garden of Sinners epilogue of what the other Shiki says about, you know, the normal person who lives, and that you know, Mikia has kind of skipped those steps by not trying to be special, and he just lives this kind of meaningless, but in the meaninglessness, it's actually very meaningful existence. And you get that here, where it's just this little moment that is special because it's so normal. It's just so nice and normal to sit on the roof with your grandpa and look out at the cityscape and share that moment together. And it's one of the most incredible moments of characterization in this show. And that then Waver's ending comes back around to him honestly facing the grandma and grandpa and asking to just live with them for a while he figures stuff out, is like, that's the redemption that you don't see elsewhere in this show, really, and that, you know, gives you some real humanity to cling on to while Saber is, you know, breaking down in a field of swords on the battlefield and her dead, you know, friends and everything, right? It's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a really powerful moment because it does a few things. One, it's like, it's a character other than Ryder who has started to fully, I think, kind of like recognize and appreciate Waver. Not that he ever really diminished him in any way, but I think he's starting to respect him more clearly as a person. But now it's like, this is another person, right? The only thing that Waver wants is for people to sort of like recognize and appreciate him for who he is, because he's been mocked and belittled his whole life for being some third-rate mage he's like a third-generation mage or whatever it is. Oh, he's not a fancy ninth-generation mage like Canis is. And so he wants to prove this, like, he's worthwhile and he can do worthwhile things. And that's that quiet moment with the grandfather that sort of recognizes that the compassion and kindness that Waver has, that maybe that those grandkids never really had. That he does care about these old people. He feels really bad, obviously, about what he's done, which is a thing that most mages don't do in this world. Most mages don't really give a shit about normal people or the effects of using magic on normal people. Waver, I think, is really torn up about it. And so there's a certain kind of salvation there for him, and seeing that, like, he is doing some good there, like spending time with these people and like caring about them and caring for them and caring with them. And then the grandpa gives him this really important message that then leads into the last order that Ryder gives him, which is that, like, he says, I don't know what it is that you and Alexei, they call him, which I love. I don't know what like is so important that you feel you need to risk your lives to accomplish, but I've lived a very long life, and I know that there's really nothing better than life. There's nothing better than this. And I think that's part of Waver then having to accept himself as well, and accept that kind of ordinary life you're referring to from like the epilogue with Mikia, that he needs to settle into a satisfying, regular life that he can accept for himself. And part of that is like having this with the grandfather and having this with Ryder allows him to get that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's where it's like some of this feels, you know, Waver and Ryder feel one of the most distinctive parts of Fate Zero, and then it so naturally dovetails with the Kinoko Nasu themes that we've seen elsewhere, and feels like a part of this universe, which I love. But yeah, and of course, then just like, this is where the show puts the knife in the gut to make you cry, is all the stuff with Waver and Ryder in those final episodes, like Waver using all 3 command spells to command Ryder to win and take the Grail and all of that, and then he is no longer the master, and then Ryder turns around and says, well, then will you be my retainer? And dear God, that is some like Lord of the Rings Return of the King, like on the battlefield stuff with like Theoden, like doing the Riders of Rohirrim level of like, this is stirring me to my bones. It is so good, you know?
Yeah, it is. I don't think the show ever explains this directly. I think it's pretty obvious that you can intuit it. But like the command spells, the more like specific the command, the more effective the spell is, right? So it's like if you command them to do something very specific, like Saber appear at the storehouse at the manor, like that is a very specific command. And so the mana, the command spell will like execute and force them to do that or commit suicide. It's very specific, like specific command, and it will absolutely compel the servant to accomplish it. The more general the command, though, on the flip side, is like the less effect that the command spells have. So there is something about Waver is just like throwing them away, basically. Like him commanding him to go win, go get the grail. Like that's so broad and general and vague a command that like the command spells are not going to do anything. He's basically like willingly just throwing away that contract. Which, you know, maybe if he had thought about it a little bit more, maybe he could have used his command spells tactically in battle. Maybe Ryder could have won the fight with Archer. Who knows? But it's a very noble gesture. Obviously, the show's not thinking about that.
It's also a gesture he needs to make because it's symbolically, like, again, I don't know where Waver goes in the like extended fiction of this universe. You talking about the spin-off show was the first I'd even heard of that. But like to me, in my mind, watching the end of this show, he's done with magic. There's just like in my head, it's like he has to be like, this is toxic and bad, and I think he realizes it. And there's a symbolic, at the very least, like I think getting rid of the shackles of like the institutional mage stuff that all of these characters are drowning in. And I think him using the command spells that way is him shedding that part of himself. Whatever part had led him to the clock tower and down this road of trying to be the best student at the academy and all that stuff, he's done with that in that moment, and he is valuing the relationship with this person Ryder and his humanity, and that is his moment of growth. And that's why, like, yes, he could use them more tactically, but then he also wouldn't be Waver, right? Like he's not that person, and I think he's realized he's not that person. You know, the person who uses the command spells best in this show is Kiritsugu, because he is a fucking merciless killer, you know? Like, he knows pain points. That's not who Waver Velvet is. And so you get this moment, and it's just perfect and beautiful. And, of course, Ryder returns it the best way he can with that retainer moment, you know? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I was joking by saying he could use it more tactically.
Yes.
It's like, yes, Waver would never do that, and it would not matter. There is absolutely no way they would ever be able to beat Gilgamesh. You know, like Gilgamesh barely even used Ea. I had actually forgotten about that. That's like his ultimate sword that he pulls out, the world destroying noble phantasm. He just kind of like takes it out. Like he barely even fucking uses the thing, and it totally dissolves the reality marble that Ryder has for his noble phantasm. And so yes, there's no way for them to beat Archer, but it's like kind of like with everything you're saying with like Alexander the Great or Iskander here, like that's almost not really the point. Like it's about like the charge, and it's about the conquest, and it's about always moving forward, even though he knows that he will never be able to do this. I think that Ryder clearly understands he doesn't stand a fucking chance.
No.
Probably Archer would be able to beat him even without using Ea, just like chucking all of his fucking random treasures at the entire army that Alexander the Great has would probably be enough to win. He shows him enough respect to use his most prized weapon at the end. But, you know, winning that fight is not really something that Ryder can do, but he still has to do the charge because that's who Iskander is.
Yeah, I mean, Ryder, his final lines on the show is this narration where he says, "Glory lies beyond the horizon. It can never be reached, and that is why you strive for it. Tell them of my conquest, then make it happen. For the men who watch from behind you." And then as he dies, my heartbeat itself was the sound of Oceanus's waves. And just imagine that in the voice of Akio Otsuka and in Japanese, and then you feel tears streaming down your face. Because it's beautiful, and it is like the most... That's where you see kind of the actual... What's so ironic, I think, about this character in this series is that he's a grand, larger-than-life conqueror, but his wisdom, what he actually sees in the world is best for someone like Waver just to go live day to day, right? Of like, the glory of life is that it's not something that you are going to achieve and get in your hand and hold on to. Which, of course, is the ultimate folly of all these characters. That's also, you know, Kiritsugu learning that the Grail is not this thing that's just going to do what he wants, and all of these characters kind of run into this at the end. And so the wisdom he imparts is for actual, like, human beings living in the world, maybe the wisest thing anyone learns in this show. Mm-hmm. And the whole idea of the heartbeat being Oceanus, which is this fictional thing he dreamed up, but it is what beats his heart, you know, God. And, of course, you put that fucking poetry in the mouth of Akio Otsuka. There's just not enough good words to say about him. I think last time we had a big discussion about Otsuka, I feel like Sean was probably on Weekly Stuff when we talked about Yakuza 7, Yakuza Like a Dragon, which he is phenomenal in. And I said his character there was maybe my favorite Otsuka performance. And I would probably, no disrespect to that performance, I would probably amend it here to be Rider, because it is just, and again, this is a actor, there is no wrong answer to what is the best Akio Otsuka performance. They're all great. But man, what a towering work that uses that booming, beautiful, human, expressive voice he has just so perfectly. Like, I cannot imagine anyone else playing that character. I just can't even begin to imagine anyone else.
I mean, I remember very distinctly that you talking about that on the S2E07 podcast, me having to bite my tongue because I was like, he hasn't seen Fate Zero yet. He doesn't know. It's just he doesn't know that it's Iskander. But no, I mean, Iskander here is like a really special character. I mean, so much so that he's not even used much in the spin-offs, honestly. Like, I think because he's so good here, like Fate Grand Order, he's like a character you can get in that game from like the gacha and stuff. He's in it. They did a Fate Zero like story event in that game where he's obviously in that story, although there's not much, like Fate Grand Order doesn't have a lot of voice acting in it. So like it's not a thing about can you or can you not get Akio Otsuka. But in most of the other like events or the original story for FGO that uses lots of characters from the original shows and stuff like that, they don't really bring him back much because I think he's so good here. And it's like, it kind of feels like if you wanted to bring this writer back out to do something with, you got to make sure that you have something like worthy of this character. Because he is such a special character, I think, in the scope of the franchise.
It's such a finished story, right? Even if somehow you didn't know this was a prequel, you can point to Saber and Gilgamesh and Kotomine and all these characters and say, okay, there's lots of room to do more here, right? But like Rider, it's because it's so good. It's like they told the story. Like the only thing you kind of could do is a fun historical prequel about him doing his conquest. Mm-hmm. But even then, I don't know how much that would add other than it would be fun to have Akio Otsuka do it. And that would be worth it. But, I mean, that's one of the things, that was one of the first tweets I made about this show, Sean, was just that every single one of the fucking servants is so rich. I would happily watch a long-running spin-off about their historical escapades. Saber, Gilgamesh, Rider, Lancer, just all of these. They're so great,
Yeah, that's always been one of the things I've like most wanted, even though it would be very bizarre because it's just like, it would just be a weird thing to exist when you think about what the franchise is with, the core of the franchise being their heroic spirits that are summoned into the modern day and used by modern day mages. But I've always wanted a like full King Arthur's Legends, but this version of it with this character and all that would be so fucking cool.
Yes. That would be the best one to do because you have all the Arthurian myth to play with. Like, you would be able to do like, obviously we find out Berserker is Lancelot. How would you build up to that tragedy? That would be a great show if they ever want to play around with that. I'm sure there's plenty of writers who could give that a shot and do a great job with it. But yeah. But you could do it with lots of them. They're such vivid characters. You could see them all. This is part of the fun of Fate Zero. It's an ensemble, but you could see almost every character being the leader of their own show. And that is kind of a rare thing with ensemble-based storytelling, where like any of these characters could be the protagonist of another show, and that's how rich this cast is.
Absolutely. While we're still on Waver and Rider, I was thinking about the ending, or like the last scene between Rider and Archer. My favorite moment that Waver gets in this whole show is right after Rider dies and Gilgamesh walks up to Waver and basically like interrogates him and says, it's like, hey, if you are your king's retainer, shouldn't you get revenge for him? And Waver says, if I try to fight you, I will die. And Gilgamesh is just like, yeah, obviously. Yeah. It's like, yeah, toes and dado. And then Waver says, well, then I can't because he ordered me to live. And then Archer looks at him, breathes, turns around, walks away, and says, like, I commend your loyalty, like, never let it falter, and dissipates. And it is like, you get this brief vision of, okay, Gilgamesh is like a much larger than life character, and it's like, you see mostly his bad side in this show, but there is this, like, he was a hero, he was a king, like, he does hold some things in, like, respect, and one of them is Iskander, right? There's a key moment at the Banquet of Kings where Gilgamesh adjusts how he refers to Rider. Originally, he calls him Zashu, or what they translate to as mongrel, which is how he refers to like everybody because nobody can compare to Gilgamesh. But during that banquet, he starts calling him King of Conquerors, Safegulo, and retains that through the rest of the show. And so it's like, Iskander has earned Gilgamesh's respect, and I like that in that last moment, in its own small way, that transfers onto Waver, because Waver has like the courage to stand up and like actually speak back to Gilgamesh, which is a pretty terrifying fucking prospect, especially when we have seen all the shit that Gilgamesh can get up to in this show.
And Waver saw it just then, killing his like best friend, because it's great. We never, I think it would be natural. I definitely assumed that the final matchup of this show would be Saber versus Archer. And we don't get that at all in the final run of this. And it makes sense because, like, Archer is so overwhelmingly powerful here. I'm not sure what Saber would do against him, really. Like, even, with what we see of her, it's the Grail itself that winds up kind of beating him, for lack of a better term. And I'm not entirely even sure what happens to him at the end, because I know that's all set up for stuff we will see in the Fate Stay Night adaptations. But you wanted to, maybe we should go over there then and talk about the King of Kings.
Okay, talk about the King of Heroes.
King of Heroes, Gilgamesh, and his two masters. Oh boy, Kotomine Kirei, maybe the most evil character I've ever seen in a piece of fiction.
Yeah, there's that little moment right at the end of the show with Rin. I had forgotten. I had forgotten that detail that he gives her the dagger. But yes.
Oh, Sean, I had to write this down. Kotomine, just like set the balance for this conversation.
Yes.
Kotomine Kirei, I wasn't sure who he was in episode 1. I mean, I wasn't sure where he was going to go, because he doesn't seem good or bad in that first episode, right? He's very neutral. He's working, for the church, and he's working for the other family and all of that stuff. And it's not clear where his kind of die is going to fall. And I think you did a very good job, Sean, saying, yeah, he's a big part of Fate Stay Night, without tipping your hand that, oh, he's the big bad here, isn't he? But like, the ending of this series is Kotomine Kirei killing Tokiomi, getting another horribly abused poor soul in Mato, Karia Mato, to kill Tokiomi's wife, or not kill as we find out, but horribly maim and give her brain damage. Then Kotomine Kirei does the reading at the funeral of the man he killed, adopts his daughter, and then gives her the knife he killed her dad with. That series of events is like the most evil thing I think I've ever seen anyone do. Oh my god.
And there's like if you blink and you miss it, but there's a little moment after Rin starts crying after he gives her the Azoth dagger that is the proof that you have graduated from the school of the Tosaka mages or whatever, that is the dagger he used to kill Tokiomi with. And Rin starts crying, and it cuts back to Kirei, and then there's just a brief moment where his mouth turns into a smirk and his like eyes darken, and then it cuts, and it's like, yeah, he is a fucking monster.
It's so fascinating because it's an arc I can't say I've ever seen anywhere else from a character who, again, not knowing anything else about Fate Stay Night, when you see him in the beginning, you could imagine him being more heroic, you could imagine him being more villainous, but he is kind of on this neutral edge because and this is what Archer Gilgamesh recognizes in him over their conversations, is that he doesn't want anything and he doesn't know what he wants. And so he starts kind of needling him. And his arc is to become like this embodiment of the purest evil. And it's this journey into that. I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like that. And it is so chilling to watch that, like, it really is that stark of him actively embracing the worst things a person can do as his, like, goal in life. Like, it is chilling.
Yeah, because he's a person who's like, he's like fundamentally empty, right? The thing we learn in the first episode, this is the thing where you have that great scene where Kiritsugu is reading about Kirei and then Kirei is reading about Kiritsugu, is that Kirei has like, taken all these different, like, learned all these different magical schools and stuff in martial arts or whatever, and always taken it up to the point where he could have been like a grand master of this art. He is a genius. He's a prodigy. But he's never taken it that far. And every time he switches, he was an executor in the church for a long time, and then he switches out of that. And it's like he seems to have never found a place to settle anywhere. because there's nothing that he wants, or he doesn't. I mean, really, as you understand, it's that he doesn't understand what he wants, partially because he's a member of the church. Like he associates probably like everything that he has these like instincts maybe to go for. I imagine he took some like sick pleasure in his job as an executor, which is basically a mage hunter for the church. But like all those things are things that the church says is wrong and evil. And he like clearly like takes it seriously to a certain extent. It's what he keeps on using to argue against Gilgamesh with, is like, that's a sin, like that's wrong. And Gilgamesh laughs at him and says, like, why must you always equate bliss with sin? Like, why can't it not be fun? Like, why are you so closed-minded about these things? And then slowly Kotomine starts like breaking down those boundaries, and he gets this kind of obsession with Kadia, because Kadia is this just like miserable person who's like fundamentally seems like a good guy, but just like is in such a dead-end spot in his life. He never inherited the Mato magic. He never, he has this like infatuation with Aoi Tosaka. And obviously like that never went anywhere because she married Tokiomi and had Sakura and Rin. And he's like this weird hanger-on of that family, always admiring their happiness, but always being alien to it. And so Kide is like, and this actually starts happening in that Rin episode, because that's where you see that he's specifically observing Kadia after Gilgamesh prods him to like, go figure out why these people are in the Holy Grail War. Figure out what their motivations are. Even if it seems frivolous to you, maybe it will give you some enlightenment. And he latches onto Kadia. And then slowly that, like, I think opens him up to this, like, very sadistic side of him, that because he's so empty, because he's so hollow, because there's, like, nothing good or noble he really wants to accomplish in this world, and he gains no pleasure from the things that normal people gain pleasure from, he gets amusement by pushing things to their, like, extreme in the sadistic way. But it's not just like hurting or killing people. It's making a whole performance out of it, and that amuses him, right? And there is something so sickening about it, because it's about this very twisted form of pleasure, and that's it. It's just finding amusement in the pain of these people as he manipulates and pushes them into their darkest instincts.
And it's a really interesting comparison with Joji Nakada's other performance we've already talked about in the Kinoko Nasu verse in Kara no Kyokai, Garden of Sinners, where that character is the big bad of that series, but is, like, we see less of him, obviously, but is much more principled in the weird way, in the sense of like what he is going for, has a very clear sense of self and of like the worth of what he's trying to do. What he does is horribly, horrifically evil, in a way that like the evil that is imagined in the Nasu verse is like on a fucking biblical scale. It is like,
yes,
it is grand, horrific evil, and of course, obviously exemplified in the Paradox Spiral film with what he does to all the families there. But it is such an interesting comparison, because it is Nakata playing both characters. There's obvious similarities in the performances, but they are ultimately very different, because there's this sick sadism that is not there, I think, in Kara no Kyokai. It's more like utilitarian what he's doing there.
Yeah, and we're catching this character in this point of development, right? Like this is Kide is like one of the major antagonists of Fate Stay Night. Obviously, you can tell that by the end of Fate Zero. And so this is, as a prequel, this is partially like his origin story. How did he go from being an executor for the church and this kind of prodigy of the church to being this monster, and also like how he became the person who's like, he's in the church in Fuyuki City and he has this relationship with Rin and all that kind of stuff. There's also like one other detail that they go into more in the Fate Stay Night visual novel, and they actually make brief reference to it here, that also shortly before the events of Fate Zero, Kotomine's wife dies. So he was married, and she dies, and that's also part of his character, that like he took a wife like frivolously, like in a sense of like he didn't love her, he didn't feel it, because he can't feel that kind of stuff for people. He just did it because that is the thing that people are supposed to do. And then when she dies, he similarly feels nothing. And so that is part of what sets him on this path. is I think that is like that realization that, oh, this thing that is supposed to be this noble thing that gives people this like sort of this true love that gives people like this true bliss or happiness, for him, he felt nothing from it. And then when it was taken away from him, he felt nothing from that either. And that is part of what sets him specifically into this path of, well, then what is there? What can I feel? Right? His whole thing is the only reason he wants the Holy Grail is for it to tell him, like, what am I supposed to do? What the fuck am I? And that's why he wants the whatever is in the Grail to be born into this world. That's what he like begs Kiritsugu before he gets shot. It's like, let that thing be born. If you don't need it, like, let me find out what is this like evil in my heart, because that's all I want to know.
And of course, the just dark, sick irony of the show is that, at least in his own mind, he wins the show. Because at the end, I don't know, it depends on, I guess, how you read it because of what happens. But to him, he wakes up and with Gilgamesh, and it seems like the Grail granted my wish by showing me this devastation and pain and horror and destruction. So literally, Kiritsugu's nightmare becomes Kirei's like dream. And that is how we kind of end the show with those two characters divergent. And it is it's a brutal but brilliant piece of writing. I mean, all of that, everything, how that all ties together at the end is just some of the most brilliant writing I've ever seen in anything. But yeah, he is a bastard. The first like big meaty conversation he and Gilgamesh have, when I do also love when Gilgamesh is like out of his battle attire and he's just chilling at the mansion with his wine, and he's just got like a muscle shirt and he's just hanging out. It's so funny. But he is just this fucking heathen hanging around needling Kodomine Kirei. And their first, like, big, long conversation, which I remember being, like, the whole back half of one of the episodes, it's just this long dialogue they have. And it felt to me like it's the dark inversion of one of the, like, Toko dialogues in Kara no Kyokai, where she will logically walk you through something. And Gilgamesh does the same thing, but it is this dark, twisted, fucked up logic of why morality doesn't matter and bliss does matter, and you should separate pleasure from sin and morality, and walks up to this line with Kodomine. And I'm just like, this is like if Toko were evil and wanted to fuck with people, this is what she would be doing, and that's who Gilgamesh is in this scene.
Yes, no, it's great. And he's also like the serpent, you know, in that kind of very biblical sense. Partially because like serpents are a big part of the actual epic of Gilgamesh. That is the thing, that is the artifact that they use to summon Gilgamesh, is the molted skin of the first serpent of the world from his myth. And then in that scene, they zoom in on Gilgamesh's eyes and they give him snake-like eyes, which I don't think they ever actually... I don't think he's normally portrayed with like these like snake pupils, but they do for that scene because it's like... Yeah, that is very much what he's doing. He's with a priest, you know, It's very biblical, everything that's going on there.
I mean, something worth saying is that we've talked before about how a lot of Japanese media engages with Christianity in the same way you'll see American media deal with, like, Norse mythology or something, right? Like, it's not really informed in any deep way on the actual stuff, and it's using it for kind of the fun, surfacey images and symbols that we kind of get out of it in a pop cultural sense. That's pretty much what Neon Genesis Evangelion does with Christianity and a lot of shows. This one actually, I think, does engage with like some Christian myths and ideals in a pretty deep way. I mean, there's actual scripture in the final episodes with Kotomine quotes the whole Valley of the Shadow of Death psalm. He does that in Japanese. And then at Tokyo Matosaka's funeral, he does another psalm in English. He says it. And, you know, so you have stuff like that. And I do actually think their use of the Valley of Death is like really interesting and like thematically resonant. And then stuff like this with like the kind of the Adam and Eve and the serpent and stuff like that. You know, it's not the primary focus of this show, but it is striking like, oh, this actually has like, it's more informed on some of this than you usually see. And it's an interesting perspective.
Yeah, and it is something that like I wouldn't normally characterize the way the Fate uses the church stuff in that way. I think it is a particularly Fate Zero does it really well here. Partially because like the church isn't as big of a focus usually. Like it's because Kirei is a point of view character, which is pretty unique, that like it really gets involved in that stuff. And also I think like maybe perhaps Udabuchi Gin is a little bit more interested in exploring that, because normally I would say like the church stuff is more of the like, it's cool. Right. It's cool to have like the dude with the priest stuff and have the crosses, and they have their fucking crazy daggers that are shaped like crosses and shit like that. But yes, in this show, I do agree that they actually use it effectively to really characterize Kide, because so much of it is about this, like, this hatred of his father as well, Kotomine Ise, voiced by Ramba Rao, which is a thing I had not remembered until I rewatched the show. The cast of the show is also, like, top to bottom. It's all, like, there's so many Gundam people in this fucking show. We've got, like, 3 Gundam protagonists in this goddamn show. But all of that, like, also builds it up, I mean, the main thing that he does, Kotomine, when at the end he sees the destruction of the civic center and the surrounding population in Fuyuki, and Gilgamesh tells him, like, this is the Grail showing you what is in your heart. And Kide laughs, and it's like the only time you see this character give this, like, belly laugh. It's very chilling what Nakata Joji does with his performance there. But he laughs and he starts ranting about, like, is this me? Like, it could, like a disgusting mongrel dog like this have been born from the loins of Kotomine Rise? And it's like, I think there's so much suggestive stuff about this relationship he had with his father. Gilgamesh identifies that after Rise is killed, Kide is upset because he wasn't the person who got to kill his own father. And I think there's, like, this clear resentment about the life he had in the church and, like, the restrictions that put on him and all those kinds of things. And Kotomine just hadn't been able to grasp that that's what he's feeling. And he has this, like, deep hatred of his father that also has, to me, like, biblical tones, right? Because there's a little bit of, like, Kotomine has a little bit of almost like Lucifer-esque arc to his character where he's, falls from grace, and, like, rebels against his father and all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. And speaking of, like, how they use the scripture stuff, one of the most striking moments of the whole series to me is it's the anti-penultimate episode. So Ryder and Gilgamesh have their final confrontation. It's the line I said earlier where Ryder is dying and he says, "Oh, my heartbeat itself was the sound of Oceanus's waves." And then you cut to Waver, Velvet, like, on the ground crying over what has happened. And that is when you have Kotomine come in with the recitation of the Shadow of the Valley of Death psalm, which usually starts with the line, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Like, that's where in pop culture you often see people start it. They go a couple lines earlier and they start with the part about he restores my soul, he leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And I think overlaying that over Waver Velvet, Morning Rider, after all this dialogue about leadership and guidance and, like, inspiration, and then you go into the rest of the psalm about, I fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me, blah, blah, blah. Prepare a table before me, and you have that layered over, Irisville being on the stage at, like, the opera house where they're going to stage the final ceremony, and that's kind of how we end the episode leading into the final 2, and it ends with the line, "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life." It is so fucking chilling to have the villain of the show reciting that psalm in, like, its full extent over the scenes of, like, the table setting of what's to come in the final episodes. It's just a brilliant little touch.
Yeah, it's awesome. Yeah, it's yeah, and just hearing Nakata Joji with that, like, incredibly deep, such a rich voice he's got, like, reading the scripture, whether it's the Japanese, or I also love him reading the English version at the burial scene. It's just, like, there's something very powerful about that voice, and getting it, that kind of, like, poetry is very powerful. But there is also another really great voice paired with this character, because I always laugh whenever Kide and Tokiomi are in a room together, because it always feels like Nakata Joji and Jaime Sho, who's the voice actor that plays Tokiomi, are having, like, a contest to, like, who can have, like, the richest, deepest voice possible, because it's like these two characters, it's so, like, it's crazy how deep their voices sound. And I love that these two characters are paired off, and that it almost feels like you needed to get someone like Jaime Sho that has a voice similar to Nakata Joji's to play Tokiomi, or it's like nobody would be able to, like, play those scenes with Kotomine otherwise, because it's like you need this, like, battle of the manliest fucking voices you've ever heard. But you also have Tokiomi, who is a really great character as, like, this counterpoint to Kotomine, as this man who, like, has such a clear vision of what he wants, right? He wants to reach the root. It's the thing that his family has been doing for countless generations. It's what he will pass on to Dean, right? He is so unwavering in his vision of what he is trying to achieve, even with, like, even if I don't achieve it, it doesn't matter because I have faith that either Rin will achieve it or maybe even Sakura will achieve it. Even if she's a member of the Mato family, that my descendants will like carry on in this very like inhuman way. He is so confident in this. And it serves as like an interesting counterpoint for Kire, but as well as like he's so blinded by his pride as a mage and his belief in these things and his belief in like that there are like right and wrong ways to go about what is happening here in his own like mage-like fashion that is exactly what gets him killed, with him never really participating in the Holy Grail War at all. You know, Tokiomi only, I think, really once steps out of his fucking manor. It's to do the caster stuff, and he has that brief duel with Cardia that he wins easily, and that's it. And it's like when Tokiomi's finally like, okay, now I've done enough scheming and enough like laying my plans in place, and that is the exact moment where he gets stabbed in the back, and the dude never really participates in the Holy Grail War all the way to the end.
Yeah, it's great. I am glad you brought up the point about the deep voices because, I mean, this is a show, it's got those two, it's got Akio Otsuka, it's got a bunch of other actors like, you know, Rikiya Koyama, who plays Kiritsugu. He's no slouch when it comes to the deep voice department. Yeah. You've just got all these deep voices warring with each other, and it is hilarious and wonderful. But yes, Tokiomi Tosaka, I mean, he's a very different kind of evil also, because he's more of the banal mages or pieces of shit evil. But like you also see kind of on the ground level with Mato Karia of just how destructive kind of his whole worldview is with what he does with Sakura and Rin. And I think that's where we should bring in all the stuff with Karia, because I think most of the fundamentals of his character are laid out in that first episode, and we talked about them last week on the show. But just seeing how that evolved, and I think that's actually part of what's so striking about his character, is that he does not really evolve past that point. He is that pitiable, that pathetic, but also in his own way that noble, because he is trying to do one of the like more noble things in this cast of characters. Yes. He is trying to rescue this little girl in this family. And of course what that gets twisted into by Kotomine Kire is like, I think, the height of villainy in this fucking series, because the scene where he lures, first he keeps Karia alive out of like fascination. That's the first time he goes against Tokiomi Tosaka, right? Of like, okay, now I'm going to start betraying my master. And he keeps him alive. And then he lures him to the church at midnight where Tokiomi is dead. And then the wife, what's her name? Aoi. Aoi comes in and sees it and thinks that Mato has done this. And then he goes, wild with all the disappointment and frustration of his life and winds up strangling her. In the moment, seemingly to death. We later learn she survived with brain damage. I'm not entirely sure which fate would be kinder. And that scene, like, I want to say Shakespearean tragedy, but I don't think that's right. Shakespearean tragedy is more like what Kiritsugu's arc is. What happens in that scene is more like fucking Greek mythological tragedy or full-on biblical tragedy. Like, it is hardcore, crazy, myth of Oedipus, I killed my dad and fucked my mom. Like, it's horrible to see what unfolds. And you've got Kotomine and Gilgamesh up in the rafters watching it, practically having like popcorn in their hands. I think Gilgamesh does have like wine because he's
they're both drinking wine, because Kotomine has that, it's like where he like takes a sip and then he just like gulps the whole thing down, and he says like, has wine always been this intoxicating? Like, if wine can be this delicious, then I would certainly like to try some more.
Yes.
And that's the line that they end when they cut to black, because every episode has the best endings, because they always like end with this big line that's like a mic drop, and then it just cuts to black with the title card and the timer at the bottom.
Yes.
And that's the line that ends that episode.
Fuck. It's evil. It's so evil, and it's so well executed, and it's this slow motion tragedy you can see coming, because from the first episode, it's just very clear this show isn't going to end with Mato Karia winning and reuniting Sakura and Rin, and like Aoi like kisses him as he dies or whatever would be his like nice ending. It's just not going to happen. But the extra knife twist of him then becoming a participant in destroying this family, he not only doesn't get his goal, but he makes it so much worse with his dying breath. That is where it's like, that is biblical or Greek or like high tragedy,
Yeah, it's so fucked up. And you have that great scene between Kotomine and Zoken, Mato Zoken, who's in the show just like sparingly, the patriarch of the Mato family. He's a character that we'll see more of in the future. But on the rooftop, he comes in and you know, it's not actually him. It's like a specter of him made with his weird bug monsters. But he just sort of like taunts Kotomine and laughs and says, you know, that he doesn't, you know, Zoken doesn't really think has never thought that Karia was going to win the Holy Grail. He's been doing this because Zoken is just like Kotomine. He takes no pleasure in the good things in the world. Like, you know, he's this weird, wretched old thing that like just wants to cause like death and mayhem and get power. And that's it. And he has this line where he says, like, you are just like me. You two were attracted to the smell of the rotten meat that is Matokaria. You're just a maggot. And it's like such a great line that I do think like that Kotomine takes some displeasure in being described that way. But I think it's so good at cutting to the heart of what Kotomine is. He is this maggot that is just like feasting on the rotted flesh of anybody who is like good in this world, right? He just like wants to eat away at them, like this little bug. And I like that like Mato Zoken is the character in the show that probably has the best understanding actually of what Kotomine Kire is, because they're both toying with Karia the exact same way.
I mean, maggot is a good word. They're feasting on death. They're feasting on destruction and corpses and pain. Yeah, it is. It's bad shit. And yeah, so Kotomine's whole arc, the whole idea, because you get that moment when he's talking to Gilgamesh, and then the symbol of the command spells appears on his hand, but he doesn't have a servant yet. And so then there's this tension through the middle stretch of the show of which servant is he gonna get, because some of them have started to drop off. Like Assassin is the first to really go, and at that point he's seemingly out of it, but then he comes back in. But then you also have like Berserker is kind of on the loose with Karia, but he's fascinated with Karia, and for a while I was like, is he going to kill Karia and get Berserker? You have, Caster, because Caster is so evil, you could see them going together or something. But then, of course, I'm sure, like, this is probably one of the biggest differences if you're watching this as a prequel versus your first exposure, is you, Sean, would know, having read Fate Stay Night, exactly where it's going. For me, and this is part of what makes this show so good, is it works in both directions. There really is this tension of like, oh, I'm really curious which character is he going to kind of wind up with here. And of course it winds up being Gilgamesh, but like at first you don't even think of that happening because it requires him to do the worst thing, which is to kill his master, which he is so set against early in the show. But then he does it, and he and Gilgamesh team up as long as he continues to entertain Gilgamesh, which he does a very good job at by being a piece of shit.
Yeah, because I think you're right that the show does a good job of it. It can work both ways, because it is, I imagine, you know, for you, if you don't know where the story is going, there's this great, like, where is it going to go? Because there are so many options at the midpoint of the show, so many pathways you could see it potentially going. But if you're like me and you know, Kotomine and Gilgamesh are associated in Fate Stay Night, and Gilgamesh is still around in Fate Stay Night, you know, it's like it means something's going on there. You know that these characters are going to get paired up. It's like, when and how does that happen? Because I think my read of it is that Gilgamesh, part of the reason he starts doing this with Kire in the first place is that he wants to be Kire's servant. Gilgamesh hates being with Tokiomi, because Tokiomi is like this slimy fucking coward. You know, again, like Tokiomi is this guy who makes this big show over, you know, doing things like we're mages and we have to follow like the rules of the mage association and all this stuff, and this is the way we should fight. And he's also the dude who started cheating like fucking 5 years before the thing even started. Like his whole relationship with Kotomine is him cheating. And he has this whole thing he's been working with with the church, which they're supposed to be a third party that is there to ensure that the rules of the Holy Grail War are followed. And it's like Tokiomi has been manipulating the whole thing from the fucking start. And it's like, to be this like dirty, rotten cheater who also is this hypocrite, that is also a fucking coward and won't even go fight. Like, Gilgamesh, I think, despises Tokiomi. And Tokiomi, like, always, whenever he's with Gilgamesh, he's so, like bowing and being like, oh, my lord, my king, and all this stuff. Like, he doesn't even have the dignity to, like, behave like a master, which is what he is. Like, he should be the master in the contract with Gilgamesh. And so I think Gilgamesh finds him this, like, boorish, annoying little man. And so I think, like, the whole time he is needling Kotomine, it's because he is trying to get this exact scenario to happen. Right. He wants someone who's a more interesting master, but he himself can't kill Tokiomi because Tokiomi has the command spells. So like that's part of what is going on with the sort of like the seduction in a way of Kotomine is Gilgamesh wants to be free from this annoying boorish maid.
Yes. Well, because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but Tokiomi uses the first command spell of the series to get Archer to back off in that first big kind of battle royale that's going on. And from that point on, he has no respect for Tokiomi. It's like, this is such a cowardly waste of your command spell. It's so stupid. Because also, Archer probably could have just killed everyone there, if we're being realistic.
Yes.
Like, I don't know. I don't think it would have gone well for most of them. And so he does that. And then you have that point later on during the battle with Castor where Archer could very easily wrap this thing up. And Tokiomi is trying to get him to do it, and he won't. And Tokiomi's like, I could use a command spell, but he won't respect me anymore. And I'm like, dude, that ship has sailed. You're fucked either way.
Yes.
But it would be, that's one of the things that I'm excited to one day watch this a second time, because I think that must play very differently. Like, I wrote that in my notes, that I think the Kotomine side of the show with Gilgamesh and Tokiomi and all of that is probably the thing that plays most differently to a new viewer versus a viewer for whom this is a prequel or they've seen it before. But it, like, I can see how clearly it works in both ways, and that's what, like, makes this, in a way that, like, I think even other prequels that I really love and respect, like Gundam The Origin or the Star Wars prequels, you do definitely need to have seen the, like, source works for those to have their impact. And Fate Zero does stand on its own so clearly, and that's one of the things that is so impressive about it is, you know, stories as complicated as what's going on the Kotomine half of the show can work in either direction. That's pretty rare, I think, for a prequel to achieve.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I was always curious about, like, as someone who obviously have never been able to see the show with that lens, because I had read the visual novel before I watched Fate Zero. I was always kind of curious how that stuff played out. So it's interesting to me that it's like, okay, like you're not sure whether or not, like, what direction Kotomine is going to go and if he's going to be evil and how deeply he's going to be tied to Gilgamesh, because it's those characters are so closely associated in Fate Stay Night that it's hard to try to even, like, put that out of mind for me watching Fate Zero.
I mean, I think it's part of what probably made this such a hit for viewers around the world who had no association with Fate Stay Night, is that it really is a surprise how dark Kotomine goes. It is like, that is not, if you, again, just all you've seen is Fate Zero, that is not, I think, the prediction you would make from the opening episodes. It's like, this is where this side of the show is going, and it's really fun to see it go there, even though, of course, if someone who, I assume he also does very evil shit in Fate Stay Night, you probably would be watching them going, when's he going to do the evil shit? This is crazy to see that he's more neutral at the beginning here. But they do it well with all of these characters. And it's, you know, again, I think the only thing in the whole show where I would say I feel like maybe there's a resonance here that I don't know is the Reen episode. And even then, that episode is still good and does stuff for, like, Kotomine's character, as we mentioned earlier, with him, like, spying on Karya, that it still works. But I just think, you know, that is clearly like, okay, this is the young version of a character who's a hero in a later story, and it's fun to see her in this role. But it's a little disconnected from the story being told. Again, it's just one episode, but it's probably the only place where the prequelization feels like you can feel it. But other than that, it's so seamless.
Yeah, and that episode definitely partially exists because Dean is a super popular character, and it like, that would be an episode to go back and rewatch after you see Fate Stay Night, because she, like, seeing little girl Dean, who, like, also should, I think, technically be, like, 6 years old. It's like there's a little bit of fudging of the timeline there, because she's I think she's 16 in Fate Stay Night, because that happens 10 years later. It's just like, there's no way she's 6 years old.
She's very precocious, Sean, you know?
Yeah. She grew up very quickly, because she's clearly like 8 to 10. But yeah, so that episode is there for you to, like, have fun seeing the, like, adventures of young Dean, and, like, how fucking unbelievably adorable she is, and how good Ueda Kana, the voice actress, Yoimiya from Genshin Impact, is at doing that voice for, like, the little girl version of Dean. Like, I'm always very impressed whenever I see that episode. It's like, man, I can't believe that she's able to do that, because she almost sounds like a different person, how much she's able to make her voice sound younger.
Yeah. No, it is fun, and it is something I would like to go back to later on, just because of that, but it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Should we, sorry, go ahead.
Well, because I feel like one character we didn't actually talk about that directly is Gilgamesh and all that stuff. Because one, just need to shout out one of our other Gundam boys in the show, one of the few, Seki Tomokazu, or Domon Kashu from G Gundam, is the voice of Gilgamesh. Seki Tomokazu also is in like a million fucking things.
He's in a million fucking Gundams, Sean. He's in like half the Gundam shows.
Yes, he's also Izak in Gundam Seed, yes. I mean, he's one of the most prolific actors in Japan for voice acting. And this is one of his most iconic roles, is Gilgamesh. Obviously, he's a much bigger character than just Fate Zero. But it's such a fucking great character. I love Gilgamesh so much. And this, like, other than there's a version of Gilgamesh you get in Fate Grand Order, that is my favorite version of the character. But other than that, this is my favorite, like, performance of Tomokazu Seki. I guess this would be my, like, second favorite performance of this character in Fate Zero. There's just something about... He's such a fucking bastard in the show. He's such a monster. But I think you do get just enough of those glimpses of his, like, interactions with Ryder and stuff like that, where you see, like, there is a dark and, like, kind of twisted nobility to him as well. You know, the pompous nature of the character, where he can so confidently assert that, like, he's in the Holy Grail War because the Holy Grail already belongs to him. And Ryder says, it's like, well, if you saw it, would you be able to, like, recognize it? And he says, like, no, but, like, the confines of my treasury have long since outspread my ability to, like, remember or recognize all my treasures. But if a treasure exists in the world, it must be mine, because all treasures are descendants from my treasury. And I couldn't possibly allow some, like, grubby mongrels get their hands on my treasure without my permission. That's the only reason he's fucking fighting this thing. And it's like the ability that Tomokazu Seki is able to, like, as a performer, I think, pull off how much you really kind of believe him when he says that shit. It's like, well, you know, you're a fucking pompous monster, but it's like, you're maybe kind of not, there's a part of you that's maybe not even wrong, because he's Gilgamesh. He's the oldest hero, right? He's the hero from the oldest existing story in the history of humanity, the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is part of what gives him this place of priority in the order of heroic spirits, because he's the progenitor of all of these things, of all of these epics, certainly from the Western tradition. And so he gets to sit atop all things as this king of all heroes. Yes,
it's a fascinating character, because you're right. There's no, like, he's not putting on airs at any point. It's so clearly, it's a ridiculous thing to say that it's mine because all treasure is mine. I don't need to recognize it. It just, if it exists, it is mine. But Tomokazu Seki sells it so beautifully of, that is not him putting on airs. That is not him saying something ridiculous. That is just something he believes as a fact, as clear as gravity or air, right? And the thing is, when you actually see him in action, you understand why. Because he barely lifts a finger over the course of this show. Like, it is so trivial to him. If at any point he were really given the commands to, like, go in heavy, he would end this thing pretty fucking fast, as we see in the battle with Ryder. Yeah. Ryder, who I think could be able to beat most of the other ones pretty easily, right? Other than maybe Saber. And he has no chance against this guy. We see a tiny fraction of his power at the end when he finally pulls out Aya and everything. And it's you know, mind-bending. And then it's gone, and it's over very quickly, and he moves on without a scratch. And, you know, then his last big scene of action is squaring off against Saber and demanding she be his wife, because, of course, he owns her. She is his subject, even if she is also a king. Because even the people he does come to respect, and he does come to respect some of them, and that is where you see the heroism, is he does believe some people are worthy of respect, but it's an extraordinarily high bar for him to get there. You know, versus Ryder is giving out respect left and right. He likes everyone, right? If they're mildly upstanding or have some potential. Gilgamesh takes a little more. But yes, he is a fascinating villain. And again, I have no idea where that character goes, what kind of role he plays in the future. It's just, in this one, it's fascinating because he is both so detached from the action. He has no stake in this thing. He has no wish. He plays a very minor part in the actual action of the series. Outside of killing Ryder, his actual impact on things is extremely minor, but it is the conversations he has with Kirei and the kind of other perspective he brings to the, the round table of kings here that is so fascinating that despite him being so aloof from the proceedings, he feels like such a major part of it. And it's so cool.
Yeah, and then he does have, I think, like the best looks in the whole show. You alluded to, like, whenever he's just like on the couch with a fucking glass of wine and he lets his hair down and he's wearing this like Babylonian shit. Like, it looks like people should start feeding him grapes, basically. Like, that's a great look. And then I always love at the very end of the show, after the Grail like sort of is partially destroyed and the contents leak out and all that shit happens, you then get this great shot where it cuts to him and he's just like ass naked sitting on this rock, and he just, and it's like he's just, obviously they're covering up his bits or whatever, but it's like he's just sitting there naked for like minutes at a time on screen as he's having this conversation for Kirei, who then picks up like a blanket or something, throws it to him, and he like swirls it around him like a cape, which I love. Also because I love partially because like Gilgamesh can summon all of his shit, as we've seen, at any time. Like, there's no reason why he can't put on clothes literally with the snap of his fingers. He could be donned in his armor or whatever else he's wearing. He doesn't need to actually physically put on clothes. But he's just very content to sit there literally in the nude, just chatting with his buddy.
I mean, he's like posing in the nude. He's sitting there like he's posing for like an ancient portrait that would go up in a museum and you would see today. It would be a famous image of Gilgamesh, on the field of battle nude. And again, even in that position, it seems like someone should be bringing him grapes and wine, right? Yes. It's great. Just that character is extra. Let's say that. He is very, very extra, and it is a great execution of that whole idea. Yeah.
Yeah, I just love him. Gil, he's one of my favorite servants in this franchise. And this show is a big reason why. He's just, what a fucking great character.
One of the characters I'm most excited to see in the future shows we're watching, because I'm just very curious what his specific role is. Obviously, it'll be related to Kodamine Kirei, but I'm curious what kind of role he plays in the drama, because it seems exciting. Should we dive into the meat of the kind of core of the show here and talk about Kiritsugu and his side of the show?
Sure, yeah. Because there's a lot, obviously, because I think like Lancer obviously is like wrapped up in that swirl as well with Kiritsugu.
Yeah, because Lancer is technically, his master is Kaneth and all of that stuff, but they almost don't matter, except as this thing that Kiritsugu runs into. But man, because, you have a bunch of characters here. You have Iris Veal, and you have Maya, and you have Saber, all kind of wrapped up in this. But at the heart, you do have this character of Emiya Kiritsugu, who we don't even at the beginning realize how dark he is, right? Like, I thought it was kind of interesting that, he's bringing a lot of guns to Fuyuki City in that first episode. And I was kind of curious what all of that is for, because obviously it's not for these larger-than-life heroes we're meeting. He's not going to go up to Gilgamesh with an Uzi and do anything to him, right?
Yeah.
But over the course of the series, we learn, he doesn't give a shit about the servants. He barely interacts with Saber. Like, his first meaningful interaction with Saber is the one where he's done the worst thing he's ever done and then gives this justification for it, right? And other than that, he does not really pay attention to the servants at all. He's going around fucking brutally massacring the masters, down to like, before you hit episode 10 of this fucking thing, he's brought down an entire building in the middle of Fuyuki City. He's done a fucking 9/11 in the middle of the city to kill like 2 mages. It's incredible. But I think the like turn this show makes into real, and this is where I feel like it feels like Shakespearean tragedy of the things that make him who he is are the things that stop him from being able to achieve his dream, right?
Yes.
It is that kind of story. It is Hamlet is not a tragedy if Hamlet hears from the ghost and then picks up a knife and goes and kills Claudius. That's just a normal, story. What's tragic about Hamlet is his indecision and the things that lead him to making such a mess of things that it's a massacre at the end, right? And for Kiritsugu, it's not a tragedy if he took the lessons of his early childhood and went and built houses for people, or did something like that, like positive into the world. It's that he could only, the thing he is good at, the only way he can see of seeing the world is through violence and trying to achieve peace through violence. And it brings him to this point at the end of the story where, because of that, the Grail can only offer him violence. And I think that entire transformation and that key scene in, I think the best scene of the whole show is what he does to Lancer and to Caneth and the wife, and then the explanation he gives to Saber, which just so brutally takes apart the entire idea of chivalry and heroism and gives you this brutal but very honest view of the world. That is where, for me, Fate Zero leapt from this show is incredibly smart and entertaining to this is an all-time great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's because it's slowly building those pieces for that character, right? He's in the shadows for so much of it, particularly like after his duel with Caneth. He's like out of the show for multiple episodes at a time. Like it's like purposefully, partially to like make Ryunosuke getting shot like a shock. Because, like, you haven't seen Kiritsugu for a couple of episodes at that point, and then he, like, re-enters the show by shooting him in the fucking stomach and popping him in the head. And then, then he starts systematically going after the other masters and killing Caneth and all that shit he does. But yeah, they play out those pieces very slowly to get to that point where, as I said earlier, it's like basically it's his ultimate retort on the Banquet of Kings and this, like, discussion that is throughout the whole show, but is like focused from that Banquet of Kings thing, and they touch on it multiple times, like when Saber uses Excalibur, and his ultimate reply is like, all of this is wrong. Like, the existence of these heroes is fundamentally wrong, because what you do is you glorify violence, you glorify warfare, and you inspire people, yes, but you inspire them to go fight. You inspire them to go conquer. You inspire them to go kill. And maybe they're doing it for good causes. Maybe they only believe they're doing it for good causes. But it's like you are inspiring more conflict and more warfare. And that is the thing that Kiritsugu has been fighting against his own life. Of course, the tragedy and something that Saber identifies, but that Kiritsugu can't confront until he actually is in the Grail, is that if the only way he understands how to, like, make things better is through violence, that is the only way he will ever accomplish anything, is through more and more violence. And eventually, once you take that to an extreme, nobody is left for him to kill, right? It was part of the conclusion of the show, what he ultimately rejects at the end. But it is a really powerful character arc because, as you say, it really dismantles a lot of what you get wrapped up in with the heroic spirits, because they're these really fun, larger-than-life characters and these big myths and legends, and you're so captivated by their, like, chivalry and, like, these incredible deeds that they're able to accomplish, and then Kiritsugu comes in with this, like, spite for them, because what he sees them doing is, like, is inspiring more and more violence in the name of things that are good, but he doesn't see those things as good or worthwhile. He sees chivalry and honor as completely perfunctory things that you sort of, like, sprinkle on top of all the murder you do to make it justified to other people.
So I want to hone in on this key scene and everything that leads up to it, because we see Kiritsugu and Maya having a very creative approach to the Holy Grail War, which is to wage just a full-scale, like, guerrilla ground war against the Masters, bringing down a building on Caneth, fighting with, he's got these bullets that we learn are made from his ribs that will, like, attack the origin of a person, or bring his origin into their body and destroy their magical circuits and all of that stuff. And, he's fighting them, and then we have him killing Ryunosuke, and a lot of this is violent, but it's horrifically violent sometimes, but it's violent against pretty shitty people, It's like violent against, like, if he's going to shoot Ryunosuke in the stomach, go for it. That guy's a serial killer of children, that's okay. The world is better off without him. Even Caneth is a piece of shit, and it is actually very satisfying to see him brought low by, he's got all this magical power, and it means absolutely nothing in the face of Kiritsugu's methods, right? And that is joyous to watch. I enjoy all of that. But then we get to this episode where you finally, because then we have to bring in the other side of this, Sean, which is Lancer. Because Lancer is one of the coolest characters in the series. Love him. He's another Gundam boy, isn't he?
Yes, it's Hiro Yui.
It's Hikaru Midorikawa. Just we need to do a count at the end of this of how many Gundam boys and villains and characters are in Fate Zero, because it's hilarious. But yes, Lancer is Hikaru Midorikawa, and that is the first connection made in the whole war, is Lancer and Saber meeting, and like they have chemistry. They hit it off. They're great. They're buddies. They have the same kind of views on kind of like chivalry and heroism, and that they're going to have this noble fight. And there's this long running thread, because in their first battle, Lancer gets a key hit on Saber and cuts a nerve in her hand, and so she can't use her thumb on that hand. And so she's sort of crippled and knows she's going to have to beat Lancer and destroy his magical curse, bearing spear to be able to fight him. And they kind of come back into each other's orbit a couple times, but have to team up. You have the big kind of show-stopping action sequence in the middle of the show with Castor, where in order to beat Castor, Lancer has to break one of his two lances to like lift the curse off of Saber so she can use the full Excalibur, right? And you have all of that, and then you finally they meet in this kind of bombed out parking garage or wherever they are, and they're going to fight, and they're having this great, and this is like the height, I think, for the viewer of like the chivalry and the good feelings you get from that, and the like.
Saber refuses to use her left hand because it's the one that was injured, so she's like only fighting with her right hand, and she has this line, it's the most Saber fucking line ever, where she's like, no, like if I used my left hand, the shame of it would dull my blade. The only way I can face you properly, Lancer, is with this one hand, in like my like true chivalric spirit of a knight, like behind my blade. Like it's so, romance of, like the Knight of the Round Table and all that kind of stuff, those kind of romantic chivalric tales of old. It is like they even like, I think intentionally they're dial it up to 11 to set up what happens in the back half of that episode. And
I don't know about you, Sean, but like that kind of stuff, you watch it and you're high on it. It's like, so it is like those moments in Lord of the Rings where like, Boromir calls Aragorn his king and stuff like that. Or Theoden, will take Pippin under his tutelage or something like that, or Theoden is married, but you get it. It's just like all of that stuff is so cool. And then what happens is in the corner of this like lot that they're in is you have Kiritsugu with Kenneth and his wife, who's Solawi. It's a very hard name to say because it's very long and weird. Yes. But you have her and you have the both of them. They've cut off her hand. That's one of the things that happens in that episode, is to get rid of her command spells. They cut off her hand and then shoot it into smithereens. So you have them both there, and is threatening to kill her unless Kenneth will sign this magical binding contract whereby Kiritsugu cannot harm either of them, but they'll have to do something. And then what we learn that thing is when we see Lancer suddenly impale himself on his lance. He dies cursing everyone around him. Saber is horrified because we're at the height of this chivalric romance going on, and then it is, boom, it's just extinguished. She's gone. And then Kenneth at least is like, but you'll let us live. He's like, yep, I cannot move against you. Maya, do your thing. And then Maya shoots them both in the head, and they're all dead on the ground.
Well, it's worse than that, because Kenneth is like on the ground gasping for air. He's got a little bit of life left. He begs Kiritsugu for death. Kiritsugu says, I can't do that. I'm contractually obligated not to. It's basically what he says. And that's when Saber walks up and uses Excalibur to kill, like put an end to Kenneth. And like blood splatters on her face, which she has for the rest of the scene to kind of set the conversation.
Right, I forgot about that detail. Yeah, because then it's Maya kills the Solawi, right? Yeah. Oh God. Oh no, it's right. She shoots, but yes. Okay. I'm forgetting the exact sequence of events.
She shoots both of them with one shot. He survives very briefly, then is put out of his ministry because again, Kiritsugi can't do it. Like they go into excruciating detail with this long monologue with Kenneth about like the Geas scroll and the effects of it, that like, oh, if he goes against it, his soul will be like bound and cursed forever. Or it's like even like all of his descendants will also be bound by the contract of this, because it goes through your soul, and so all your descendants will like carry this curse with them. It's like it goes into the excruciating detail of like how binding magically this contract is. But of course, all it takes is like, well, somebody else just does it, and it's like technically, you didn't read the fucking fine print, buddy. Sorry.
Yes, exactly. And I think that's what makes it feel so cruel, is that it is the perfect Kiritsugu logic as we come to understand him, right? It is, instead of risking all of this death and destruction and everything else on this chivalric, sense of honor, he kills 3 people. He kills 2 people in a spirit, you know? And that's all it takes. It's some paperwork. It's 2 people. You fire, it's a couple of bullets, and that's all it is. And it's extremely simple and calculating. And that is what makes it feel so it is the exact polar opposite of Saber's entire worldview, right? That instead of this honorable meeting with our, whatever faculties we have on the field of battle respecting each other, it is the exact calculating polar opposite of that. And then it leads into this dialogue between the 2 of them, which I went back through the episode and wrote all of this down because I think it's the best piece of writing in Fate Zero. And I want to go through this just because it is such an incredible dialogue that happens here. So Saber is, protesting, and Kiritsugu says, "There's no point in trying to explain anything to a murderer who can take pride in things such as honor and glory." And Saber retorts, "You would even insult chivalry to my face, fiend. A knight will never save the world. They pretend there are right and wrong ways to fight, as though there is honor on the battlefield itself. These illusions named honor and glory created by the words of heroes have entranced countless young men throughout history, leading them to their deaths." Saber, "They are not illusions. Even in the taking of another's life as a human act, law and principle must still hold. Otherwise, every single war would unleash hell on this world." Kiritsugu, "And there it is. You heard her, Eri. Our heroic spirit says that war is preferable to hell. What idiocy. War is hell itself. Hope does not exist on a battlefield. There is nothing but indescribable suffering, just the victory birthed by the pain and anguish of the defeated. But humanity has never learned, because in every era, larger-than-life heroes have blinded the masses with fantastic tales of their deeds until no one can see bloodshed's inherent evil. Human nature has not evolved since the Stone Age. Justice will not save this world. I have no interest in pursuing it. If you commit evil in the name of hatred for evil, your anger and hatred can only bring for... Oh, sorry, that's... I missed a line.
That's Saber's response.
That's Saber's response. My typing was wrong. Saber responds, "If you commit evil in the name of hatred for evil, your anger and hatred can only bring further conflict. Emiya Kiritsugu, I know not who or what betrayed you or what has caused you such despair, but your anger and sorrow, those belong to one who once sought justice. Kiritsugu, as a young man, you too hoped to become a just hero, correct? More than anyone, you believed in and longed to be a hero who would save the world. Kiritsugu, I will break this endless cycle, and the Holy Grail alone can make that possible. The blood I spill in Fuyuki City will be the last blood humanity will ever shed. If I must take on every sin in the world to save that world from evil, I dirty my hands gladly." Jesus Christ, is that a tour de force series of exchanges, beautifully performed by both actors, and just cuts literally, you talk about, Sean, that this show is hard to put down. That's a point where I had to put the show down to think about it and be because it's confrontational to the viewer, of, as we were talking about, that you're kind of high on the thrill of what is going on between Lancer and Saber, and then it is Kiritsugu, I think not unreasonably, making this assertion against it, and this is bullshit. This is all violence. All it can inspire is violence. And this is an insane way to view the world. And of course, Saber is also right in her retort of saying, but you're doing what you're accusing us of, right? Which is using violence to solve it. But it literally, it's the kind of moment that you'll get in Watchmen or something, where it really deconstructs a genre that maybe you have real affinity for and knowledge of, and makes you stop dead in your tracks and go, what is the pleasure of this thing I'm watching? What is the nature of these myths that are embedded in society, which is the myths that Fate is playing with in this series, Fate Stay Night.
Yes.
It's so fascinating. To me, that is the mic drop of the series, is that turn. And so much good work is done with it past this point, obviously. But it literally makes it impossible to think about the themes in the same way once you've seen that. It's incredible.
Yeah, because again, I think for me, it is the final participant in the Banquet of Kings has showed up, and it's the common man, right? It's Kiritsugu representing a normal person. Obviously he is extraordinary in what he can do, but the world he lives in he's not a fucking king, he's not a hero, he's not a legend, he is an assassin, but he has lived a normal life amongst normal people and sees the consequences of what these heroes represent. And I think it makes you reflect back on things like Ryder and Saber. I mean, you always know that Gilgamesh is a fucking tyrant. It's like, it doesn't make you think differently, particularly of him, because like, you're already a monster. But both the kind of like the noble things that Ryder and Saber seem to stand for, it makes you stop and reflect about them. That Ryder, that conquest has the conquered. And it's a thing that Ryder doesn't seem to particularly think much about, is who are all these people that he has conquered, and do all of them like that he has like rid through their fucking town and taken over. And then, for Saber, it's all the violence that has dominated her entire life. Right. And that like it has, kind of, emotionally crippled her in many ways. It's the thing that she's like specifically struggling against was her rule right? Is her approach right? Was what she was doing the right thing? Is this sort of code of chivalry and this belief in honor and these ideals that she tries to embody to be this perfect king, which is what she wants to be? Like, is that the right approach? Or has it made her such a like alien, inhuman figure that nobody can understand her, nobody can sympathize with her, nobody can follow her because she is too perfect? And that's part of what she's struggling with. And I think it's just like a really powerful moment with Kiritsugu just cutting through all the bullshit here as a character who has been, lurking in the shadows of this show all the way up to this point, very enigmatically. They don't like ever really put a fine note on what is it exactly that he's trying to wish for. You get the sense it's like they say something that like he's trying to save the world. This is where you start getting that actually like sort of verbalized more directly by Kiritsugu. You're getting more of a direct sense of the world that he came from and what he's trying to accomplish, which is something you've never really seen. And then this segues into, you have like one more episode after this, and then after that you have the 2-part flashback episode that fills in his backstory. But yeah, it's a really powerful moment. I think one of the things that this show is really interested in, Fate Zero specifically, I think it's one of the things that makes it have this very classical, tragic quality to it, is I think the show is very interested in pride as a theme, right? That like you have all these different characters have a different version of pride, right? And like the heroic spirits, typically like Ryder, Lancer, Saber, have this very classic version of pride that's about honor. It's about doing the right thing and upholding like principles and these like virtues, this very old world kind of perspective. And then you have the mages, who are also very prideful, but in this much like less acceptable way, right? Like both Tokiomi and Kaneth are deeply prideful people, but they're also fucking scumbags. They're also like liars, and they're cheats, and they're murderers. They don't respect other people. They don't respect life. All they respect and all they want is their own power. But they take such incredible pride in their own magic. In their magecraft is their pride, and that almost makes them inhuman. But then you've got both Kide and you've got Kiritsugu, who are two people. Kide, who has never had pride. I don't think he understands fundamentally. I don't think that's like a part of who he is as a person, and that's part of what makes him empty. And then Kiritsugu has like intentionally abandoned all pride he has as a person in order to try to accomplish this goal he has to save the world. But it has led him to like throwing away any pride he could take in the methods or the way in which he lives his life. And that's what makes it so uncomfortable. He has no, and that's both what makes him uncomfortable and also really effective. It's why the mages can't beat him. It's because they can't imagine the methods that he's going to use, because they take so much pride in their magic. They trust their magic so much that Kiritsugu's like underhanded tricks, the very like direct matter-of-fact way that he approaches things, and then his ability to disrupt their magic circuits means that them relying on their prideful magic is exactly the thing that brings about their own destruction. But it's also the thing that us as viewers, when you see what he does with Lancer, it's like, it's such an inhuman act what he does, to make these promises and to break them so nonchalantly, to defeat a servant by forcing the suicide of that servant, which is such a like grossly inhuman act. It's the act of like someone who must have abandoned any pride they have as a person in order to bring those things about. I like that. For me, Fate Zero is very much about how like there are downfalls on both sides of that scale, right? To be too prideful is bad, but also like what is it to like the opposite doesn't then mean it's a virtue. To have no pride is also something you have to contend with. Like, what does that mean, and what are the consequences of that? And that's the kind of person that Kiritsugu is.
And the corollary to all of that, of course, is ambition, which is tied to pride, but it's not always one-to-one, right? Because Kiritsugu has, as you say, shed pride. His ambition is enormous. He wants the complete remaking of humanity, right? And I think a lot of this show is also about the downfalls of ambition, and sometimes the lack thereof also with Kotomine, in that he has no clear ambition. And so that's another way they are shown as kind of opposites. But yeah, I think you're right. I think it's one of the most interesting kind of like thematic through lines throughout this entire series is that idea, and to see how it plays. And that because Fate Stay Night as a franchise, and this show obviously is playing with all the servants are these mythical heroes who anybody watching this has heard of and knows the myth of Gilgamesh and knows the story of Alexander the Great and knows King Arthur, at least on a very surface level. We know what feelings are supposed to be kind of inspired by these stories. We know why we still hear about these people who, in some cases, are only pseudo-historic, like King Arthur, right? Like the actual like King Arthur that we know is not really a historic figure. It's a mythical figure. And obviously the Alexander the Great we're working with here is a very clear mix of myth and history. And Gilgamesh, we're talking about historical timescales so far back, it's hard to say.
Who knows if there was anything based in reality in the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Right. So, that's the kind of things we're working with. But the reason why we still talk about these myths is because they're things we want to believe, right? Yeah. They make order out of an unordered world. They give us, it's exactly what Saber says in that scene of like, law and principle have to hold on the battlefield, otherwise every war would unleash hell. The myths are in some way these mental like blockades we build around our brains and our cultures and our societies to shield ourselves from the very real hell that is every war ever waged in any, case. They are the stories we have to tell to allow ourselves to do that and to see that. And sometimes I think those myths have more, goodness to them or reasonableness to them than others. The myth of what brought us to the Iraq War is total bullshit. The stories we tell about, around like World War II are more justifiable, right? But they're in all cases, we do justify the things that are done through stories that we kind of put together and tell. And I think there's just such a brutal confrontational logic to what Kiritsugu brings here. It also feels kind of like a mirror of something Toko would say in Garden of Sinners in a very different way of like, it really is, when you break it down, it is abject bullshit to say these things, and to believe in these things as a prism through which we try to make our world palatable when these things are just not palatable. And of course, that then leads into Kiritsugu's entire backstory and the 2-episode flashback where we see, I think he, just as much as these others, has also built a myth around himself and a story to be able to live in the world as he lives in it. In some ways, he is very frank and honest about what he sees. And in other ways, because of the trauma he has gone through and because of this original failing in his mind of the girl he did not kill when he should have, and that led to the destruction of his island, and then that becomes this original sin or original memory that keeps coming back to him. He's had to construct this whole force where violence is virtuous through the elimination of violence. And it's so fascinating to see, I think, the different ways human beings grapple with violence and war, as this show demonstrates.
Yeah, and that, like, the tragedy of Kiritsugu is he is a person of, like, incredible idealism. It's the only way he was able to, like, get to this point, right? It's the thing that Kotomine doesn't understand, that separates him and Kiritsugu, is that he's a man that is fundamentally driven by a childish, like, ideal. As Irisfield says before Kotomine kills her, like, his ultimate wish that he wants the Grail to grant is world peace. And she, like, specifically phrases that in the way that, like, if you're, like, 10 and it's like, what do you wish? And it's like, oh, I want world peace. And that's, it's this very kind of childish wish. But he wants to be a hero. Specifically, they use the term Seigi no Mikata in Japanese, which they translate as, like, hero or just hero, which I appreciate because it's oftentimes translated painfully literally as ally of justice, which is what it literally is, but it means a hero, right? In this very childish way, he wants to be a hero. It is a term we are not going to be done with. You're going to hear a character say Seigi a lot when we get to Fate Stay Night, so I might as well bring it up here. But like that's the thing that ultimately drives him. That's part of his backstory. Is that night with Shirley? She asks him like, "What do you want to like? What kind of grown up do you want to be?" And he can't answer. And I actually didn't remember that he doesn't say it in that scene. You don't actually get him saying that he wants to be a hero until the very, very end of the show. Is the only time he verbalizes that desire. But that is what he was going to say to Shirley, and then of course everything goes to shit later, and he's too embarrassed to say it. He's too embarrassed to admit that the thing he wants to do is to save the world and be a hero. But that desire is the like engine that drives him. But tragically, because of what he encountered, and as you say, that thing of this belief that if he had just killed Shirley, he would have been able to save all those lives. It means that the only way he can think to help people is by killing bad people that are going to hurt good people. And that's the only thing he can understand. And it's what drives him. It is what, like, it is the only method he understands of trying to save the world and trying to make his dream of being a hero come about. And that is exactly why it is the only thing the Grail knows how to do when he tries to make a wish on the Grail. The only methods it can use to grant that wish are the methods that the person making the wish understands. So he only understands violence, so that is the only thing it would have been able to do.
Yeah. And that, flashback episode, or 2 flashback episodes, is so masterfully done. Mm-hmm. I think it's really an interesting choice to, interrupt the action at this point for 2 consecutive episodes. This is such a fast-moving show with so much plot. I could very easily imagine Ufotable making the choice to do a single episode flashback where the A part is him as a kid and the B part is him with the woman who sort of becomes his surrogate mother. But they don't do that. They give it into 2 full episodes that really breathe. I also like that there is this interruption between the Terminus of Honor, the episode where we have this whole confrontation we've been talking about, and then you have the 8th Contract, which is the episode about Kotomine Kirei and killing Tokiomi and making that full step and then forming a contract with Archer. And I think I could see them having the flashback right after Kiritsugu does this thing and gives this logic to Saber. But I think it's very smart that we go into the flashback having seen Kirei take that full step into villainy, and then we go back and see the full context of Kiritsugu, because I do think some of Kotomine's steps kind of reverberate through the flashback as well. Because one of the things you said there, Sean, is that his Kiritsugu's belief is if he kills the bad people, he'll save the good people. It's not even really moralistic in how he's thinking about it, though. It's if he kills the needed people, right? Because Shirley wasn't evil. His adoptive mom isn't evil. His dad is, we find out, is a piece of shit mage. But like mostly it's not about like making a judgment of these people. It's a judgment of the situation. This is what the Grail sees when it beckons him later on, is like, you have a boat, 300 people, 200 people, which one do you save? And he just immediately is, well, of course it's the 300 people. But the 200 people are going to try to stop you. And then he sees himself killing all of them, right? And it is this like brutal mathematical logic, because in those 2 flashbacks, we have these 2 scenarios. One on the island where his horrible mage father has been making vampires who really act more like zombies. And he does not kill Shirley in time. And so the whole island is destroyed. And then Natalia Kaminsky, the mercenary, saves him. And then in the 2nd episode, they're working together. They're doing all these assassinations. But most of the episode is about this other shitty mage that Natalia is trying to kill in the air. And he takes a little boat out into the ocean and blows the airplane out of the air after saying that she is his mother, which is one of the most brutal emotional scenes in this fucking series. Yeah. And in all of those cases, we see this logic emerging of, it's just someone has to be able to pull the trigger because of that foundational memory when he wasn't able to. And again, in the cold mathematical logic that he kind of starts seeing the world through, it always makes sense. And that's what's so like enticing about it. But it also is a myth in some way,
Yeah, it's a thing that has trapped him because he's given up on trying to find anything better. He's sort of accepted that like he must take the most direct, efficient way of cutting it off at its source. I mean, it's part of like the whole symbolism of his name, Kiritsugu, which reflects his origin, which is what his whole like magic bullets and all that shit is that it's kiru to cut, and then sugu or tsunagu to reconnect. And so he's about severing and then tying things back together. But as Natalia says, he's not healing things. He's not restoring things. Like when you cut a string and you tie it back together, like where that cut happened, the string is now thicker. And so it's like, that's why those bullets are able to disrupt the magic circuits, is because it severs the circuits and then connects them back together again. But it's like tying somebody's veins back together after you've severed someone's vein. Like, just because you tied it together, it's not going to work anymore. And so that causes their magic circuits to explode. But it's the entire logic he has for his whole life. It's like, identify whatever the fault is, whatever the thing is that needs to be cut out, cut that thing out and try to tie things back together. But with the Grail, like when that is taken to its ultimate extreme, if you give a man who that's his philosophy, and that's the only way he knows how to fix problems, is to cut the bad by bad thing I mean like whatever's like the thing that's going to cause the problem out, and then tie things back together. When that is given to a man, and then you have the miracle of the Grail that allows you to do it on an infinite scale, eventually you do that enough and you don't have a string anymore because you've cut it to fucking ribbons. And you maybe you're trying to tie the last little two pieces together, but you've killed everybody. And so that's the problem with his philosophy. He stopped trying to find any other way. He stopped trying to be better. And so it's like he has accepted, as you say, this kind of myth he's told himself that this method is the only method really for him to try to like save the world as he understands it. And then it's the appeal of the Holy Grail is this hope that this thing will be able to give him some other way, even though he can't fathom it, he can't imagine it. That's what he believes the miracle of the Grail will give him, is some peaceful way to accomplish this thing, but that's not what the Grail is.
Yes. And it's such a good tragedy. It's like in the way that like I think it's a form of fiction, and I think you would agree, Sean, because I think we've had this conversation before, that I think is actually very hard for modern storytellers to do and to imagine and to think about. Because, I mean, one, it's like difficult to pull the trigger on a story like this, I think. But I think it's also difficult to set up the story in the way where you're really going to get to this, broad, tragic brushstroke where you do take everything that is the essence of that person is also the thing that brings about their downfall or their failure. I remember being in a Shakespeare class in college, and my professor, who, his life's work was studying Shakespeare, and he was very smart about tragedy, and he was explaining that, like, the difference between tragedy as we use it in, like, the news, like there was a act of God, weather event or something, and someone dies, and that's terrible and that's sad, but that is not tragedy in the Shakespearean sense, because that person didn't do anything. The weather wasn't summoned by man. There was no tragic interference in that sense. It's actually kind of funny. I remember the example he used was 9/11, where he said, people say 9/11 is a tragedy. It's not in that sense. And then I've always thought about it, like, but it is. America totally brought it fucking on. It actually is. It's actually a very classical Shakespearean tragedy in some sense, of this belief that all of our imperialism would just never come back to haunt us, right? But anyway, putting that aside, this is so smart in that way. And I think it's also is able to do it without ever having Kiritsugu be a flat or simple character. He is so complicated. I think that strain of that he is embracing this darkness, but he is also such a almost childish idealist. Mm-hmm. And he also loves so large, right? Like, he has very heightened emotions for people. Iris Veal, right before she dies, one of her lines is, he's been forced to discard everyone he's ever loved in order to make his ideals reality. He's too kind for his ideals. Even though he knows he will lose them, he cannot stop loving others. And we see that throughout, right? He is never able to actually close off that part of his heart. He, when Maya dies, he is torn up about it. In the flashback, when he fires the rocket launcher and blows up the plane, he is all together through like that last half of that episode is like this long, excruciatingly long trip out to sea on his boat and conversation with Natalia over the radio and him firing and watching it come down. And then he just breaks because he's not actually like emotionally equipped for this. And that thing is just tearing him apart. And of course that also is his route to salvation in the end. Yes. That is something he can come back to. So it's a tragedy, but one that he does build something out of in the end through Shiro. But again, it is such razor smart, tragic storytelling. Because I think the thing that makes a real tragedy in that sense so powerful is when it is an inescapable loop. Where, like, you can't actually go back and look at the point, like, what is the actual turning point? It's all of these things accumulate, and it's a loop that you're never going to get out of. And that's what makes it so haunting.
Yeah, and there are, like, a lot of points along the way that really, like, are really brutal. Like, as one of the scenes that struck me that I don't think I ever really appreciated the first time I watched the show or whatever was right before he fights Kenneth in the castle. He has this conversation with Irie where he's like, let's just stop it. Like, let's just go. Let's just leave. Let's just, you and me, let's go back. Let's get Ilya. Let's leave this and all of this behind. And I think in the moment, if you don't know the larger context, I think it's kind of confusing. It's like, at this point, why is he now just like, let's get the fuck out of here? And it's like, well, the reason why at that point he's like, let's just do this now is because at that point, no servant had been killed. And he thinks there's a good chance that like that caster or lancer or some servant is going to get defeated that night. As soon as one servant's dead, Irie's over. Irisveel's life is over because she's the container for the Grail. So all the servants that are killed, their magical energy is deposited in her body. And you see as the show goes on, as more servants are defeated, she starts slowly dying. You know, like what Kide does to her at the end, where he like strangles her, is pretty superfluous because she was going to die pretty soon regardless. Like, she was barely functioning. She was mostly able to survive as long as she did because she had Avalon, the scabbard for Excalibur, in her that was keeping her alive. But that on the flip side, what that means is that Kiritsugu participating in this war, the better he is at fighting, the faster he's killing his own wife. The more servants he kills, the sooner Irie is no longer there. And it's like, and there's no way for her to survive the conclusion of the Holy Grail War. Like, once she turns into the Grail, there ain't no coming back from that shit. And so it's like he has this one moment where he like almost tries to back out because him participating any further is him doing the same thing he has been doing his whole life, which is killing his own family. You know, he murdered his own father, and then he shoots down Natalia, and like to really sort of like for the viewer stick the knife in and twist it, like that's the moment where he says like, you are my real family, to like make it clear to the viewer that's like there is no line that he won't cross if he thinks he needs to. He will kill anybody if he thinks it's necessary, including his own family, regardless of whether they're like evil, fucked up mage dad or this woman who raised him that he really dearly loves. Like, he will kill anybody. But as you say, he always struggles with it. It always haunts him. It always rips him apart. And there's that like one moment of weakness you see where he almost tries to abandon the fight before it's too late.
But it's not a moment of weakness. It's a moment of clarity. He
Sure,
sees the cycle for a second, right? And he sees the off-ramp. You know, there's this great line from Tokiomi where he talks about the root and why he wants to get to the root. And he says, it's the escape from this world. It's like envisioning the world as like this closed loop. And then there's this point where he can like, that's the off-ramp. I can get out of this world. And I think that's it. And I just was thinking of that because that's also the actual like root for Kiritsugu is seeing this cycle and getting out of it, which he does do at the end of the show, but only after the worst version of it happens to him. You know, where not only does Irisveil die, but he never sees his daughter again, Ilya, because they erect their magical walls and he can never see her again. And so all of the worst things happen. And he almost sees his own like origin point there and takes the off ramp, but doesn't. And it is brutal. So I have some questions about Irisveil, because that is probably one of the parts of the show that is maybe not confusing. Like, I understood it like fine in the kind of plot mechanics of it all, but there is this kind of like question for me of like, so she's a homunculus, they say. So she's created. She is not like a natural born member of the family, and she is she's the bearer of the Grail or something. And like, I get what they're saying in a plot sense. Some of that didn't fully make sense to me in terms of the like mechanics of it in the lore.
So some of that stuff will be more clearly explained in Fate Stay Night, but like effectively what it is there's a few things. One, the ritual for the Holy Grail, like one thing, they do talk about it here in Fate Zero, is that from the servants' perspective, the servants are being lied to. there is no way that a heroic spirit is going to get their wish granted by the Grail, because all 7 heroic spirits must die for the Grail to be fully summoned. Because it is what the Grail actually is the accumulated magical energy of all 7 of the servants. So it's like the Grail is both like a catalyst that is used to be able to summon the heroic spirits, but then once the heroic spirits are dissipated, their remaining mana goes into the Grail. And then there's this whole thing of where this is maybe a little bit too complicated, but there's a lesser Grail and a greater Grail where there is both like the contents immediately for the magical energy of the heroic spirits. That's what the lesser Grail is. That is what, for this war, Irisveal is fulfilling that role. I believe in the previous Holy Grail wars, it was not a homunculus, but that no other. So the Holy Grail has never been successfully summoned and had a wish made upon it in this process. There have been 3 previous Holy Grail wars, but all of them have failed for different reasons. One of them being that previously the receptacle, the Lesser Grail, was destroyed. And so that's why the Einsburns have made it a person. It's so that it can try to survive as much as it can, like physically keep it intact for the duration of the Holy Grail War, rather than it be a physical thing somewhere that someone could go eventually like smash. It has survival instincts, is how they describe it here. There's also a greater Grail. That is the thing that Kiritsugu talks about, that there are only 4 locations in the city where the Holy Grail can actually fully be manifested, because there are these 4 magical locations that are like have to do with like ley lines and all that kind of shit, where the energy of the heroic spirits that is collected in the Lesser Grail is then disposited into the Greater Grail, and then that is what is meant to summon the actual magical artifact that then you use to quote unquote grant your wish. And we know that there is more involved in the nature of granting your wish and everything with that, as you kind of see that there's there's something other here with the Grail that kind of is involved there at the end. They say the term Angramanyu a lot. That will be more explained later. But
I was going to ask about Angramayu too, yes.
Yeah, they have intentionally not explained that. That will be explained later. But it is you can think of it as there is something else involved with the Grail, that it is certainly not as simple as you just make a wish and a wish happens. That is, there's
clearly a consciousness, this is some kind of living entity, and that's what I was getting out of it. But yeah, no, that's really cool to hear that whole lore and explanation, because it's not necessary to understand Fate Zero, like Greater and Lesser Grail and all of that, but I'm curious to hear, or I was curious to hear about all of that, and that makes more sense. So Irisveal is this homunculus that was created. She's still able to have a child, though, and the child is normal, I guess, Ilya?
Ilya is also technically homunculus. I don't know if they go into how much detail they get into in the lore of, the exact nature of, what it is to be a homunculus, but, they're magical. They're able to be seemingly nearly human, but they're technically magical creatures, I guess it's the same as kind of the dolls we ran into in Kara no Kyokai. Yes.
At a certain point, it has full consciousness and everything. Because, Irisveal is a person. She is obviously has wants and desires and consciousness and all of that, even if she has not existed for a full human lifespan. And that is, she becomes a very tragic character in that sense also, maybe in the small t tragedy sense. It's just you want her to have her happy family life, but then also her final scenes of imagining she did have this great family for a brief period is interesting.
I mean, she got a lot more than any of the other homunculuses that the Einsburns have made up to that point have gotten. She certainly had a much better life. Yeah. I mean, one of my favorite things about the second core, talking about Kiritsugu and Irisveal, is the animation over the second ending that gives you this story.
Yes,
you
it's
see
so good. Yeah,
of Kiritsugu and Irisveal meeting, and you see her that she is much more like a doll upon their first meeting. He's inspecting her. Then some off-screen adventure or something happens. He saves her. Some connection happens from that. And then you have this great shot of both of them kind of lounging around, and Irisveal has her car magazine that she's reading, because that's a great character detail, is that she really loves cars, because Kitsugu bought her this nice car, but the only thing she's ever done is do donuts in the courtyard of the castle. So when she's on the winding mountain roads of Japan, she's just having a fucking great time. But that ending gives you this sense of the relationship of those characters, and that Irisveal was used to be something more like what you would think of a homunculus being. She was more of a puppet and that she was more kind of unfeeling and inhuman until, like, you know, her interactions with Kitsuga allowed her to awaken to her own humanity to some extent.
Yeah, I think that second ending theme is beautiful. The song is by Luna Haruna. It's Up on the Sky, the Wind Sings is what it translates to. It's gorgeous every time it comes up because I think ending themes are particularly good at this when they actually attempt this is telling a story, you know, and I love this when we get this in an end theme. But when you get to the flashback episodes 18 and 19, those don't use the opening or ending, and they have Kalafina song Manten, The Whole Sky, at the end, which is a very haunting cinematic song. Those feel like the kind of song you would get in an Ufotable movie, I feel like, you know?
Yeah.
But I love when you come back in episode 20 and you get it again. There's like this extra resonance. I feel like you see that ending theme for the first time again because the story just plays differently when you know more about those characters. Because when you come into the second core, you actually know very little of what we're talking about. And so every time the ending theme plays, I think it has greater and greater resonance for these characters, you know?
Yeah, you just have that really amazing moment where the chorus hits, and as the chorus hits, it shows you that shot of Iris Veal cradling baby Ilya with Kiritsuga in the background, and then it gives you a shot of her like cradling Kiritsuga as he's like sobbing in bed, which, as you say, like the first time you've watched the show, you're probably like, what is the deal with that? Like, you don't know enough about the character, the Kiritsuga, yet to like understand like what is he so torn up over there. And then you see the flashbacks. It's like, yeah, I probably would be crying myself to sleep every night too if I had like killed every person I'd ever loved.
I love the detail about the car that you mentioned, that she loves to drive. She's a very reckless, but like actually pretty talented driver. And then, of course, the turn where she starts making Saber drive, and then we learn why, because she can't like physically interact with things anymore, is so heartbreaking. But Saber, I love Saber's like natural affinity for vehicles that we see.
Yes.
Up to and including her fucking motorcycle, which is so good. And one of the most Ufotable-ass moments Ufotable has ever made is her chase with Ryder, where Ryder, it's not actually Ryder, Berserker in the guise of Ryder had killed Maya and stolen Iris Veal. But the characters don't know that, and so Saber goes after the real Ryder, who is flying through the sky on his cool chariot and everything. And that chase sequence and everything that happens, including this like long, elaborate wonder they do with her weaving through all the cars, and like we even go in and see the engine, and she transforms it. That is just, you could put that in a movie theater, you wouldn't bat an eyelash. It's one of the most incredible pieces of animation I've ever seen on TV. That is the Ufotable touch, alive and well, right there.
Yeah, no, it's an amazing sequence. And yeah, it's one of those things is coming from Fate Stay Night. All that vehicle stuff isn't really there so much. Like, they don't do a lot of that in Fate Stay Night. Like, she has her riding skill or whatever because she was King Arthur, so she can naturally, like, ride whatever. She can instinctively understand how to ride whatever vehicle or mount she has. But they don't really play around with it that much. And so, yeah, her getting a fucking motorcycle and her wearing the, like, black fucking, like, FBI suit looking thing she has. She does not have that outfit in Fate Stay Night, but it is like, when you go from Fate Stay Night to Fate Zero and you have this, like, built-up association of Saber and what she looks like and all that kind of stuff, and you get like, oh my god, she's wearing like a fucking Men in Black suit and riding around on a like souped-up motorcycle. It's one of the coolest things they've ever done with that character.
There's a shot in the I think it's the second theme song to the beginning of her, like, you have several, I actually use these shots in the season 2 theme song for Japanimation Station because they're so good. You have Maya and Iris Veal and then her all kind of getting their clothes on and getting ready for battle. And you have her like tightening the tie on the Men in Black suit and then looking up. That's such a good shot. Like, because of editing that theme song and everything and then seeing Fate Zero first, I like heavily associate Saber now with that fucking black suit because it looks so good. And I do just love the idea of, we have King Arthur, she's a woman actually, and she wears this awesome black fucking power suit and rides a motorcycle. It's really sick. It's a great character. Now I totally see why Saber is an iconic character in Japanese media, because holy shit.
Yeah, because let's talk about Saber in more detail. Because one thing I'm curious about, because when we had the conversation last episode about the first episode of Fate Zero, I realized when we were talking that, like, they don't make it explicitly clear in that first episode that Saber is literally King Arthur. Because I think you can tell when she's summoned that she's a woman, but I think there's like room for the audience, if you do not know anything about that character, to like think like, oh, did they make a mistake? Did they summon someone else? When having the conversation with you, I was not totally clear if you knew that she was straight up King Arthur. So what, did you know that at that point, or did you have to move on to episode 2 before that was clear?
I'll say I wasn't clear on if any of these people were like, are they literally the historical being? Are they more of a myth that has been created from magic or whatever? Like, I don't know if I would have had a feel after just 45 minutes for kind of how the mechanics of the whole Fate world kind of works in that way. But yeah, I mean, once episode 2 makes it very clear, and then that is such a cool idea of that there was this, it's Artoria, it's not Arthur, and, you know, so she did have to, like, hide her gender, but led these armies and all of this stuff. Like, that's where I do just, like, dearly want the spin-off prequel about, like, this version of King Arthur, because it's such a cool idea, and I know in, like, the lore of how Fate Stay Night was created that this was the suggestion that Takeuchi made, right? That, like, what if we swap the genders and we have the hero be a boy and the heroic spirit be a girl? And it is such a cool idea to have Saber, because I think it just, one, it's like, it automatically, like, kind of makes you reanalyze a lot of the Arthurian myth that is kind of channeled through this in a way that I think all of the heroes do in different ways. But for her, it's like very stark because of that, because everyone is looking at her differently than they expect to, right? And as the audience, you also have to confront your own kind of biases you bring in there. And she's a great character. I think this is clearly like, this is not her main story. You can kind of tell this is a prequel. This is, you know, she is not ever like the center of this show, really. The center of some of the action, certainly. And so I'm very excited to see, like, kind of her story in the other pieces of media. But even here, just her kind of confronting, like, what kind of king she was, her failings as a ruler, all of that. Like, as you say, her ending is very bleak and sad, and it's brutal. And her final, you know, conversation with Lancelot and everything. Also, she fights with a cool fucking invisible smoke sword, and that's pretty neat. That is one of those effects that would be literally impossible in live action, because you would have to have an actor just impossibly good at miming the weight and feel of holding a giant sword in their hand while actually holding nothing. Whereas for an animator, it's probably not easy, but it's not impossible. And they're able to do that extraordinarily well over these episodes.
Yeah, and have, you know, you get some of those really good ufotable, like, 3D particle effects things they do to sell invisible air. Yeah, it's great. You know, Saber's, like, this is one of the most interesting things I think about starting with Fate Zero, is that the Saber being King Arthur is a really big twist in Fate Stay Night, because you don't know until about halfway through the first route who she is. There are reasons that'll be clear when you watch Fate Stay Night for why she doesn't reveal her identity to Shiro, but she doesn't reveal her identity to her new master in the next Holy Grail War. And so it's not until she uses Excalibur for the first time that you as the reader know who she is. So a big part of Fate Stay Night is you guessing who all the different heroes are. I mean, that's not really a factor in Fate Zero, because you have you visit all the different POVs, and all the different masters know who their servants are. In this show, you know who all the servants are basically immediately by the end of the second episode. Other than, like, Castor doesn't name himself as Gilles de Rais specifically, but in general, you know who all the servants are here. In Fate Stay Night, it's a twist, and it's like a mystery for every character. Who is this servant actually? And so it's a one thing I remember originally reading that Fate Stay Night being like, having my mind blown by, oh my god, it's fucking, like, actually King Arthur. And in this version of the mythology, King Arthur was a woman who, you know, in a Mulan kind of way, had to hide her identity. But it is I think a genius choice for the character, because I think it immediately, like, lights your brain on fire. Because if it was just normal King Arthur and it was just like pretty boy anime King Arthur, that could still be cool. But I think you would, like, know everything about who that character is the minute you realize it was King Arthur. And it's like, okay, like, that could be cool, but it's a known quantity. As soon as it's like, oh, it's King Arthur, but King Arthur was a woman and had to hide her identity, it forms so much about this very different take and who Saber is, and this, like, really kind of distant, aloof version of King Arthur who had to hide herself away from everybody. That, like, is part of, like, the whole thing with Lancelot and her, like, sort of misgivings about the nature of her rule, is that she was this, like, weird, perfect king on a hill that stands above everybody else as this like shining virtuous ideal, this eternally boyish 14-year-old, what they think is like young man, or we know as a young woman, and like this icon, and and the loneliness of all of that, and how set apart she is from everything in the world, and like her like the gender thing being a part of that is just like such a masterful stroke for that character that I think like makes that character really come to life immediately.
It also just allows them, like, this gets to be a wholly original character. There's no, You're never comparing this to another take on King Arthur. You're never thinking about another movie, or this is Saber. Like, all the time, the design is so clear, the vocal performance gets to be its own thing. Because I don't know of any other takes that have done something like this. Maybe they're out there. King Arthur is fairly ubiquitous, but like this is such a cool version of it, which also means that when you do bring in occasionally the like well-known pieces of Arthurian myth, like the Lady of the Lake, it lights your brain on fire. Like when she says that in episode 13, like the Lady of the Lake, I get my powers from her, and then she fucking runs across water, like. That's cool on its own, but then also you're thinking like, man, I want to see the encounter between like this version of the character and the Lady of the Lake, and pulling out Excalibur and all of that. It's an absolute masterstroke, because it is like there's an obvious reason why she is the most iconic one of the mythical characters in the Fate Stay Night universe, because it's the one that gets to be both the most original and the one based on the most well-known hero, right? Because none of these characters are as alive in the consciousness as King Arthur. Everyone, I feel like everyone, especially in the Western like world, has played King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table as kids, and it's such a cool idea. Yeah. I know I love the character here. And of course, in all the action scenes, she shines. The final scene with her and Berserker, finding out he's Lancelot, and the whole thing with, and intimating that, again, bringing in the myth that the thing with Guinevere happened, and then you're like, now this is interesting because it's such a different gender like triangle going on, and you want to kind of see it, and it's happening in this fucking parking garage that's on fire, and it's such a good piece of animation. So like that, those last couple episodes are so well animated. It's maybe not even in like the top 5 of what those episodes are doing, but it's amazing still. It's such good stuff.
Yeah, or for me, my favorite Saber moment in this show is her using Excalibur for the first time. It's my favorite use of Excalibur in Fate stuff, because there's such a huge build up to it, especially if you know the character. It's the big thing about her hand being wounded is that she can't use her noble phantasm Excalibur, which is outside of Aya, and ignoring like all the crazy spin-offs in like Fate Grand Order, which has a million heroic service. But like for like the main stuff like Fate Zero, Fate Stay Night, like Aya is the only noble phantasm more powerful than Excalibur, because Excalibur is like the sword of myth and legend. Like if there is a sword, it's fucking Excalibur. Right. And so her finally getting able to use it to destroy Castor, it being like, it's like setting a fucking nuke off, basically. It's what they call an anti-fortress. Most noble phantasms are described as an anti-unit or an anti-army one. Basically, like, Lancer has a good anti-unit one where his noble phantasms are good against fighting one person. Ionia Hitayudoi, Riders is an anti-army one. It's a noble phantasm good for fighting against an entire army. Excalibur is like, is there a castle that you need to vaporize? Then like, let's pull like fucking Excalibur out, because that's like the level of power it has. But that speech that Irisfield gives as Saber's like charging up, and like the spirits of light are lifting up from the land, and she talks about how like that sword is like a dream that all warriors, all soldiers, anyone who has ever fought for something sees. It is the sword of promised victory. It is Excalibur, and she fires off the shot. It's an incredible moment. The phrase "sword of promised victory." Here's like a fun thing they do in Japanese. Is for people who don't know Japanese, there's this concept called furigana, which is that kanji can be pronounced in a lot of different ways. So you can write above the kanji what the pronunciation is, but you can also play with that by sort of having it be kind of disassociating it from that very directly. So one thing you can do is have this like kind of phrase or like a sentence or something being written out, and then have it be read as or pronounced as a proper noun that is like your super move in a shonen thing or whatever. This is what they do for all the noble phantasms, is they have a phrase, and then that phrase is read as Excalibur or, Inama Elish or Ionia Hitairoi or whatever all the different like names are. And for Excalibur, it is written out as the phrase Yakusoku Sarata Shori no Ken, which is the sword of promised victory. It's also the name of the track that plays whenever Saber uses Excalibur. So it's like, that's what Excalibur means. It's like its essence in the world as a noble phantasm is the sword that promises you victory, that like whatever evil you face or like whatever like danger you encounter, this sword will promise victory to you. Like, I love that idea of like, it's the crystallization of what Excalibur represents. It's so powerful. And I think the little speech that Irisfield gives here so evokes like the idea of what this Excalibur is meant to represent.
It's an absolute dynamite scene, and it's so cool that like that's the premiere of season 2. That's like the beginning of our second core of this show, and we're going up from here. Yeah, no, it's because it is, especially like for me as a first time viewer, I don't think we don't see the sword at all until that moment. So it's been kept invisible from us. And then finally, like the air around it dissipates and we see the majesty of the sword. It's such a good payoff. And then I think, it being paired with the end of the series where the final episode or the penultimate episode ends with Kiritsuyu using the last command spell to order her to destroy the Grail. And that is what is unleashed upon the Grail, is this incredible attack. It's fucking wild.
Yeah. And I also
sorry. I was just going to say, Ufotable really likes ending seasons where the penultimate episode is basically the equivalent of a nuke goes off, and then we go off from that. That's how the Demon Slayer Season 2 does that. I'm sure there will be other ones, but it reminded me of the end of Demon Slayer Season 2, where in the penultimate episode, the big explosion happens, and then the credits just play out over the fucking smoke, and it's like basically the same thing happens here, only we get the normal end credits one last time.
Yeah. Yeah, that is very good. I love the conversation with after the first use of Excalibur between Ryder and Archer, where you get like Ryder, they watch this and Archer says like, after seeing that, would you still refuse to recognize her as a king? And it's like Ryder having to face like, if he fought Saber, he would be fucked. He'd be, and he gets fucked.
He
right?
is.
Like
he gets his chariot destroyed. Yeah.
Yeah, but even if he used his like most powerful attack, like Excalibur would wipe away that reality marble just the way that Aya did. It's like he doesn't stand a chance, and that is like there is something to the ideals that Saber represents and the self-sacrifice that her serving her people, as much as it rips her apart and fills her with like anxiety and doubt. Like at the end of the day, and this is what Lancelot says, in his internal monologue as he dissipates, that like she was the greatest of kings, and anybody who served her would say so. Is that like even with her aloofness and her kind of perfection, it meant that like everybody, I think, is the thing with Saber. You feel fundamentally safe with her.
Yeah.
Like you know that she will protect you. You know that she is righteous. You know that she will always fight for what is good. She's a very like Superman kind of character, even if she's internally like filled with doubt because she's fated to have a tragic ending. It is the fate of King Arthur to be killed by Mordred, or for them to strike each other down in the Battle of Camlan. And the whole thing that happens at the end of the death of Arthur is what happens in this mythology for fate as well. It's the point she's returned to afterwards, is moments after battling Mordred. That's like, even with all of that, what she represents and what she stands for to serve the people and to protect all that is like good and virtuous in the world is worthwhile, and it is valuable. Like, I like that the show can both sort of see the dangers of like hero worship, but also recognize the necessity and the value of having something that you believe in and believing in good things, and that good things exist in this world. And that is what Saber is. Like, I think there's a duality there in Fate Zero that is very powerful, that Saber gets to kind of like be the character that gives you that kind of conduit to this higher realm of like virtue that she kind of represents.
Yeah, and Saber, obviously, there is a historical progression here, too, right? Of Gilgamesh being the oldest, and then Ryder being the next, and then Saber being the most recent in kind of, if you lay it out on the historical map. And Saber / King Arthur is like in the modern world, across the world, I think this is, especially in democratic societies, this is kind of our platonic ideal of a leader, right? Is we want the person, and who very rarely have we achieved this, but the person who like personally sacrifices and bears the weight of the society on their shoulders, serving the people. You know, I think probably like the modern day leader who probably most clearly exemplifies that is like a Nelson Mandela or something. But it is the thing we like want out of our leaders, and Saber is the person who struggles with this. So there's something very resonant there about it.
Yeah. And then I have to give shout outs to Kawasumi Ayako, the voice actress who plays Saber, which I've always thought it's a very interesting casting choice if you think like in the moment of like 2006 when they cast this role for the original Fate Stay Night anime adaptation, that Kawasumi Ayako like mostly played a lot of sort of like very straight-laced like romantic heroines of like there's like a show called Ioti Ouch that was really popular in like the early 2000s where she played the main character who's this very like traditional Japanese beauty, a very kind of like vanilla love interest character. I think that's like the kind of character she played a lot. I mean, kind of still often plays. I think it's like if you look at her like the role she's played, Saber stands out so much as like it's such a strong, powerful character, and it's this like very mythic, literally mythic character she plays. And I've always thought it was like such an interesting casting choice, but she imbues the character with this incredible strength. But I think like what I imagine the kind of part of the thinking behind the casting is that there is this real warmth and compassion to the character that she gets across that comes from a lot of those sort of like very ideal, you know, again, kind of like very vanilla or plain love interest characters and very kind of like standard romances. But there's like an idealistic sort of simple kindness to that kind of character that she's really good at embodying that comes across so much in Saber as well. And I think it's like such a cool choice that they didn't go for like a female actress that you would more associate with playing like these very strong, powerful, like warrior type characters. That's not really the kind of character that Kawasumi Ayako typically plays.
I think that's right. And it's a very striking performance because I think that the main thing that comes through is the humanity, it's the self-doubt, it's the, you know, warmth towards other people. And when the strength is there, it's there in spades, obviously, but it's got all these other shadings, and it's a very special performance. I also wonder how many hours a week she has to spend in a booth doing Saber lines to this day with the amount of Fate stuff out there. Yes. It's hilarious to like go through her profile on like Behind the Voice Actress or something and just see like there are more Fate things than anyone could consume in a lifetime, and she's in all of them.
Yes. Well, luckily I know because I sometimes will listen to the like Fate Grand Order podcast that they do in Japan with like some of the voice actors from that game, and she occasionally, I will like find one of the ones where they'll do a like big guest star will come on, and I know that she is a big fan of like she plays that game a lot.
Oh, that's
which is
cool.
Comforting because she plays like 15 different voice roles in that game at this point. It's like ridiculous. I mean, you could make almost, I think, maybe 2 teams over of just characters voiced by Kawasumi Ayako in Fate Grand Order. So it's like she's definitely like living it up, voicing Saber. It is like easily the most iconic role she has. I mean, it's like such a ridiculously iconic role and very prolific. You know, she's in everything. If you can get even like just a one line, like there are a couple of spinoffs where Saber's not even really directly involved, but it's like, oh, but we have when one of the other Knights of the Round Table is in this story. Let's get a flashback where you get one Saber line because you gotta throw her in there. If you can see a window, you gotta put Saber in it.
That's great. I think the only other character on this side of the show we haven't talked about much is Maya, who is, I think, a really interesting character. The assassin who works with Kiritsugu, who meets a sticky end, which is very sad. But I like that character. I think the whole idea we see of her at the end of that she was like, she sees herself almost like a gun that needs to be pointed, and Kiritsugu is the one who does it. And this leads to this actually, like, it kind of does reawaken her humanity, but in this very dark sense of it's only within the worldview that Kiritsugu has kind of made. She's also a tragic character in that sense.
Yeah, I think Maya's interesting for, like, a character I think, like, to put a... Not that she doesn't directly ever come up again, obviously, but I think it's, like, a character to put a pin in or something to think about Shiro in Fate Stay Night as these 2 different people that Kiritsugu has saved at different points in his life, right? Like, it's the only we never see in detail like how Kiritsugu and Maya first encounter each other, but she's clearly like a parallel for young Kiritsugu being picked up by Natalia. Then we will also have Shiro, this other young man in the senses that he has saved, but who leads a fairly different life. Certainly, he's not like a globe-trotting fucking assassin like Maya is. But yeah, she's an interesting character that definitely, I think, in prequel type ways, gives you like a different way of looking at and thinking about Kiritsugu. She also does some badass shit. Like, I had forgotten that she just chops off Soloi's arm.
Yes.
Right? That's in episode 16. I was shocked by that again, because it's like, she's putting her arm up on the fence or whatever and like kind of holding onto the fence, and then all of a sudden it's like shop, and then the arm's cut off. It's like, Jesus fucking Christ, that is really bloody.
I just also love the relationship she and Kiritsugu has, because you have that opening like battle royale you have with just everyone sort of together in that shipping yard, and you have Kiritsugu and Maya both there with their sniper rifles kind of trying to game it out, and it keeps getting more and more complex, and I kind of love the like very low-key comedy of these two assassins like almost getting like in position, and then more crazy fucking mythical figures show up. It's hilarious. It's not hilarious in like a ha-ha sense, but it's funny in that way.
Yeah, it's like, it's the clash of the strange contrasts of here's, like fucking Jason Bourne, and then Gilgamesh from the Epic of Gilgamesh, like gets summoned out of the ether and starts shooting chain like spears at people.
Yes. So I think the only other major characters in the show we haven't talked about yet are Berserker and Ryunosuke, or not Berserker, sorry, Caster and Ryunosuke. Ryunosuke voiced by our boy Akira Ishida, just because this is a crazy stacked cast all the way fucking down. And this is probably the most disturbing side of the show, because everything they do is fucked up.
Yes. I talked about last episode that, that we didn't quite, and I hadn't remembered this, that you don't quite see all the different people get assembled yet, because Caster is summoned a little bit later by Yunosuke. And you sent me a text after you watched that episode that was like, I think it was the night we recorded that podcast. It's like, you were right. Yes. That scene with Caster, when Caster summoned, is really special.
It's fucked. It's so fucked, because they do keep Ryunosuke and Caster sort of out of that first episode, which I think is smart, because that would kind of like weigh down everything else. But that second episode is largely about them and Ryunosuke as this fucking child predating serial killer. And you have this whole scene from kind of the point of view of like the he's killed this whole family, and there's this child left alive, and he's going after him, and that's when Caster shows up. Caster lets the boy go, seemingly, but as soon as the boy gets into the hallway, this like giant phantasm appears and devours him. It is properly disturbing, and that really, they obviously Ryunosuke dies right as Caster, like basically at the season 1 finale, and then Caster is taken care of after that. So they're really only in the first half of the show, but they are the super depraved, fucked up, abject part of this series.
Yeah, they are like that first half antagonist that allows you to kind of focus a lot of like the show and like give like a sort of a common enemy. It also gives like Tokiomi has this whole ploy about like, let's offer this thing to like hunt down Caster, and it sort of organizes the chaos of all these 7 people. Because again, this show having this ensemble perspective means that it constantly is needing to be thinking about what all these characters are doing. So it needs different kind of lenses to focus them. So Caster serves as that. And yes, he's like this ridiculously evil character, it's this is one of the ones that I found very interesting as someone who didn't know anything about the historical figure Jill DeRay until I watched Fate Zero. And it's like, he's a fascinating historical figure, because he is, as like they portray here, he is both a guy who was like a Marshal of France who fought alongside Joan of Arc, and then he also became a notorious child serial murderer. Possibly an inspiration for the like fabled character Bluebeard, maybe not, because Bluebeard is obviously more about like killing wives than it is killing children, but like he's this like notorious serial killer in the past. And they even bring up like a common theory, which is that like he was also like the trial about Jill DeRay was partially motivated to try to steal his wealth and land. Whether or not that's true or not is like, that's a historical interpretation. But it's a very interesting historical figure to bring up. And one that is horrifying. Like,
Yes.
I mean, it's one that, like, if you want to read about the historical Jill DeRay, make sure that you're, like, comfortable with reading some grisly fucking shit, because, like, he was a child serial murderer and he was also a lord, so he had money, so you had people help him fucking do it because he could just hire people to kidnap children and stuff. Like, it's pretty horrifying shit. And they truly, like, the Crunchyroll version that we have is also like the original TV broadcast, so it is actually censored a bit. There's some stuff that they do not show because it involves kids. There is if you see the Blu-ray version, that has, like, it's not like the worst thing you'll ever see in your life. But it's even worse than, it's even more grotesque than what you get if you watched it on Crunchyroll. But it's a very intense, like, horror character they throw in here.
I had no idea that there was because I just watched this on Crunchyroll. That's interesting. And then Ryunosuke is his own bag of worms. I think the connection they have, which is this interesting kind of mirror inversion or parallel story to what Kotomine and Gilgamesh kind of develop over the course of the second half of the series, is where Ryunosuke gives this, like, interpretation of God and of religion, where, like, all of the exploration of the body is actually divine. It's, like, not blasphemy. So if we kill and do these grand displays of, like, of sadism, this is also worshiping God because we are working with his creations, and just this completely twisted way of viewing the world. These characters very much feel like they could be someone Shiki would go after in Kara no Kyokai, I have to say.
Yes. Yeah, no, yeah. I love, Yunosuke's whole crazy thing he comes up with, as you say, of that, like, God is amused by all the things that people do. And Ryunosuke has this, like, why would God, like, if God thought that us, like, murdering these kids and stuff was bad, why would he have made it, like, so fun? Why would he have made their, like, entrails, like, so vivid, I think is the word the translation uses. And it also then connects to when Ryunosuke dies, he sees his own blood pouring out of him. He's like, oh, like, this is the thing I've always been looking for. Like, I've never seen something so beautiful. Like, why didn't you tell me that it was inside me all along? And then he gets shot in the head. And it's like, it is a disturbing character, that, because there is, like, you can see the own fucked up logic in his mind of how all that works and how it dovetails with this, man from, medieval France who fought alongside Joan of Arc. And this is where I certainly don't think this has any real historical basis, but it is good drama here that this version of Jill DeRay clearly kind of fell to evil because of what happens to Joan of Arc and, like, her being burned at the stake and him losing faith in God, because how could God let his messenger be killed this way? And that is what drives him deeper and deeper into trying to create the worst atrocities imaginable. To, like, have God stop him is what he wanted. Right. And so then Ryunosuke saying, it's like, no, God wouldn't stop you because what you're doing is what God wants. Like, he embraces all things in life, good and evil, like, whatever entertains him. He's, like, the director of this, like, grand theater that is the world, and he just wants us to go and play our roles and be as amusing as we can be. And that sort of, like, locking in for Castor, it makes the world make sense for him, as this man who has lost his faith.
It's fascinating. We also get Saber tied in here because he thinks Saber is Joan of Arc reincarnated, which at the beginning, not knowing much about the lore, I was curious, like, is this going to be like a plot point that she actually did come back as Joan of Arc and they were the same? They don't do that. That would be a little convoluted, but it's interesting. But yeah, I think all of that is fascinating. And it reminds me, some of the logic here reminds me very much of NBC's Hannibal, the Brian Fuller show with Mads Mikkelsen, where I think a lot of Jill DeRay's and particularly, like, actually the way Ryunosuke talks about, like, the divine in the blood and everything is very much like some of the Mads Mikkelsen monologues on Hannibal is that kind of stuff. And I'm down for it, not in a moral sense, but in a for your weird television show getting into this stuff makes for good villains.
Yeah, it's pretty compelling stuff. And then you have to shout out Satoshi Tsuruoka, who's the guy who plays Castor, who just, like, that's a very over-the-top character, and he leans into it, and there's, like, this whole kind of, like, kabuki performance thing he does with it that is really great, and I love, whenever Castor is just, like, gets very emotional and he's just, like, shouting Yunosuke and Jan. It's like he leans into those syllables so hard, and there's, like, a deliberately theatrical over the top performance of the character, because he's also completely like malformed and misshapen. Like this clearly like this is a fucked up dude who probably should not have been summoned in this Holy Grail war.
Yeah, I do kind of question the logic of this person becoming one of the like heroic spirits. I'm not entirely sure how that happened. The Holy Grail has some fucked up tastes.
Yes, well, I mean, hey, it's people can become famous for both good and bad deeds, and they exist in our public like the collective unconscious just as much as King Arthur does. So
Very
it's
true.
Like, I'll say that is one of the things about the past Holy Grail wars is that someone like Castor shouldn't originally be able to be summoned, but the Holy Grail wars have gotten very fucked up. It's one of the reasons why Tokiomi is like really surprised that this is happening, is because in previous Holy Grail wars, it shouldn't be normal that someone like Castor would have been summoned, that there should be a more limited set of heroic spirits. And so it is like this ritual is becoming kind of decayed or something at this point, that someone this fucked up comes out. Because this is like the Mage Association's worst fucking nightmare, as you see with Tokiomi. This like, they're all about secrecy and protecting like the mystical world and everything from common knowledge, and then serial child murderer summons fucking Jill DeRay from the Throne of Heroes. It's like, fuck, and then he makes a giant Godzilla monster in the river in the middle of the city. It's like, Jesus fucking Christ. It's, I don't love Tokiomi too much, but that's a headache I would not want to have, is dealing with that shit.
What else to talk about with this show? Just let's get into the UFO table of it all. It's a spectacular production. It's a TV show, so you can see the points where like this scene is going to be a very long shot of two characters talking with limited motion, and we're going to rely on the voice actors and a striking composition because in the next episode we have a crazy car chase or something, Yeah. So there'll be that kind of stuff. But obviously it's never anything less than excellently done, and when it is off to the races, it's incredible. I think my favorite sequence in terms of the production and just it blew me away as a piece of animation is Kotomine and Kiritsugu's final confrontation in the penultimate episode. The fight that I was struck to notice, they are 100% fighting in the replacement Batcave from The Dark Knight. It is this giant, long room that is all lights on top and is all like I think like this is 2011, Dark Knight is 2008. That actually makes sense in terms of an inspiration, but that is 100% where they're fighting. But it is such an amazing fight because it's so you have Kiritsugu using all of his guns and all of the like kind of the mixture of magic and down-to-earth guerrilla tactics we've seen him using, and Kotomine using his knives and his magic, and that back and forth, and the way that is animated with this just camera going everywhere all around them, and then this incredible shot that sort of culminates it with Kiritsugu doing the final reload of the gun, firing it, and they do this big swinging animation that goes into the gun, bullet in the chamber, bullet going out, and then a hard graphic match to the Holy Grail like unleashing the blood within that like cracks the foundations and like consumes them. That is one of the most impressive things I've seen Ufotable make, and that is saying something.
Yeah, it's an amazing shot because also at the same time, like Kide has like thrown a bunch of knives that are like spinning around to hit Kiritsugu from the side. So yes, it's like a whole crazy like it's like bullet time from the Matrix on crack, basically is what that sequence is. Yeah,
bullet time done in 2D animation. It's like it's really mind blowing.
Yeah, it's an amazing. It's one of the Ufotable's best fights for sure. Both in terms of the animation and just the choreography. I love the moment where finally Kiritsugu gets his shot off and Kotomi tries to like chop it away because he has like his magic reinforced body or whatever he has. But it just goes right through his hand and completely fucks his arm up. It's very satisfying to see Kotomi finally get injured. He's such a fucking tank. We didn't talk about the first time we see him fight, which is against Maya and Irisfield in the forest, and she like ties him up to the tree, and he just fucking lifts the tree out of the ground after like smacking it a bunch. So it's like he's a monster, and we've seen Kiritsugu and what a monster he is fighting. So it's like it's just one of those great final battles where the capabilities of the two parties, so they're able to set it up very well, and then the animation is incredible. One of my favorite shots, it's not even a fight scene, but I love the shot when Tokiomi gets stabbed. That shot is amazing, where it like zooms all the way out and does the big 3D like camera spin around to zoom back in on the other side of him where you can see the knife has stabbed in. But there's something they do, and I don't know if this is how they animated it or if they did this like digitally with the computer, but like it's the camera is like jittering all over the place as it is zooming out and spinning around. It's a really interesting look that's like I've never seen an anime do a shot quite like that. There's something very like startling about the way that this almost kind of like handy cam look that it has that they don't do anywhere else in the show to really like sell the like shock, that this is the last thing Tokiomi ever expected. The entire world was to get stabbed in the back by Kide after everything that they've been through together. But that shot is just incredibly memorable to me.
Yeah. The final couple episodes just have an amazing series of, like, destruction landscapes, like Lancelot and Saber in the fiery parking lot, and you have, of course, the city after it is Fuyuki City destroyed by the Holy Grail, and you have Kirei going through the rubble, and then mirrored, and this is all intentional, I think, but you also have, like, Saber on the battlefield at the end of her timeline going back there, and just, like, the dark clouds overhead, because and that's also an image that we're returning to from the second theme song to the beginning that opens with that amazing shot of her from behind as the wind kind of comes up and goes into the sky in this dark battlefield. Just some of those images of like destruction being paralleled together are incredible.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of really, really amazing imagery throughout the whole show.
Yeah, and I think the second core in particular, starting with the big fight with Castor, just takes the action up a notch. Because the action in the first core doesn't demand as crazy in terms of animation production. But then you get to that second half, and it is the fight with Castor. You have the incredible fight where Berserker takes over one of the fighter jets and is going after Gilgamesh in the air. And just, that is Ufotable's 3D team just showing off their chops, and it's incredible. It's not even that important to the plot, but it's just so well done.
Yeah, that's one of those where for Berserker Lancelot in Fate Grand Order, that is what they made when you use his like special move. It's him getting the fucking jet and flying in. It's really good. Yeah, like Berserker in general is honestly like a really impressive realization of a character in the show because he's 3D through the whole show. He's 3D with this like particle effect around him to create the like mist that obscures his armor. And it's like for a show, particularly in like 2011 and 2012, to have one character be completely 3D but blend so well, because he's the only character that's like that. They use 3D in some other places occasionally for some of the vehicle stuff. They use it obviously for Castor's giant monster. That works really well. But they're also very smart that is also obscured by a mist that I think sells the 3D effect even more. But Berserker is like a really impressive execution of that. And when I was looking up some of like the stuff they said in interviews about how they made that character work, is that they did some of those sequences of where they would actually do a like 2D animated version of it, but then would like animate their 3D model on top of that, because they needed for like the particles and all that stuff to work right. They needed the character to be a 3D model or it would look really bizarre, because the 3D mist on top of like the 2D animation didn't look good. And apparently it was just like a very sort of time-consuming, but obviously very effective process to sell this 3D character existing in this world with all the 2D ones.
Definitely send me that interview, because I want to use that in my dissertation stuff. It's fascinating. But no, you're right. And I think one of the things that makes Berserker so striking is that if he looks off in exactly the way he's supposed to, because he is like a weird being even within this universe of weird beings. And it always feels like sometimes you get, especially 2011, if you get a 3D character in an anime, it's just going to feel like it's out of a different show most of the time. And instead, it never feels 1 foot out of place. It's like, this is exactly how it needs to look for this. And that's the kind of thing Ufotable is so good at with integrating 3D.
Yeah, it's a very, top to bottom, the show is just fucking spectacular.
We should talk about Yuki Kajiura. What a goddamn score. Just right up there with the work on Kara no Kyokai. Although in this vein, getting to have a little more sort of like big fun with like kind of the just giant orchestrations and the epic battle themes and all of that stuff. It's an incredible soundtrack. I just started listening to it the other day on Apple Music, and it's so good.
Yeah, this is definitely, I have to imagine this is what I think it's A1 Pictures is the studio that does Sword Art Online. This must have been what they saw, and they were like, we need to get this lady to do the soundtrack for Sword Art Online, because all of, like, the big kind of, like, the martial themes and stuff when you have the big fights, that's exactly the kind of, like, it's a similar style she uses for Sword Art Online. It's like, it just fits so perfectly. Yeah, all across. Like, there's a bunch of really iconic pieces of music here from Fate Zero. There's a couple of tracks she uses from the original game. Like, most notably, she does a redone version of the Sword of Promised Victory theme, which is what plays in the Excalibur scene. So it's like she's using some of the music from the game. The next show, Unlimited Blade Works, uses more remixed versions from the game, but yeah, like, it's just a all-time great score alongside all the other all-time great scores that Kaji Oyuki has done. It's like, it's a, because she also did most of the composition work for most of the different theme songs that play as well. Like, obviously all the Calafina stuff she did. I'm pretty sure that she wrote Oath Signed, the Lisa song. I'm not sure about the Haruna Luna song, but, like, it is not just the score for the show. It's also a lot of, like, the external music as well that's put on the show is also composed by her.
Well, this has the same effect as Kara no Kyokai, where all of the music, whether it's your theme songs, I guess this doesn't have insert songs, but it has special theme songs in episodes 18 and 19. All of it feels so of a piece. None of it feels like, oh, this is a cool pop group that had a song for us to do an anime song to, which those are fine often, but this is like, this is an extra level of special, and absolutely.
Yeah, and it's got great animation to those themes. I've always loved Memoria, which is the ending theme for season 1, which has is over these, like, images you get, which are different pieces of art, like historical art depicting those actual, like, characters. Like, the one that's most obvious is the Alexander the Great one, because that's, like, a very famous Renaissance era painting. But all of them are like, there's, like, a statue in Ireland for like Diarmuid and Gran that is like it's like this, like, tree or whatever, that is what they're referencing there. Like, I looked all this up the other day because I didn't realize that all of them were that. I knew that at least a couple of them were, but I like seeing, like, images of both. It's cool that they're reproducing, like, these different pieces of art but contextualized for these characters, but it's cool to see these characters in their time, like this is what, you've got, like, Gilgamesh on his, like, throne with a lion draped over him or whatever. Like, all those images are so cool, and it's fun to imagine the characters, like, back when they were heroes or whatever while the song plays.
Yeah. Sean, I understand why this is an anime you have seen 5 or 6 times. This is this is the complete package. It just does pretty much everything well. It does it in 25 episodes. It is an incredibly brisk watch. Not just because it's, twice. I've seen anime that are 25 episodes that feel a lot longer than this. This one just moves, and, great place to start if you haven't seen Fate Stay Night stuff. I'm not sure who would still be listening if they haven't, but you know what I mean. It's just, I could not recommend it more wholeheartedly, and it also, you leave, it does end with making you want to see the rest of the story, whether it's through the visual novel or the subsequent anime that are created, because I want to know what Kodomine does next. I want to see what impact, who is Shiro Emiya, and how did Kiritsugu's sort of, life and tragedy impact him. All the stuff that this show leaves us with. It's such a good ending for this show and a good setup for what is to come in the main story.
Yeah, because I do think, like, obviously it's also set up for Fate Stay Night, because, again, a lot of the second half of the first episode is a lot of stuff that you get in flashbacks in the Fate Stay Night visual novel, but it also serves as such a good cap for this story, where, regardless of whether you know anything about this weird red-haired kid and, like, what he will be in the future to the franchise, like, what he represents here for Kiritsugu, like, this is, like, the one person whose life he has actually saved. There's that great speech by Shiro, which, again, this is just word for word from the game, of him saying, like, I was saved by this man, and even on, like, death's door, I saw how happy he was, and I was jealous of that happiness of being able to save just one person, and all of that stuff in that big speech. And there is, like, something so powerful, I think, getting to the end of this story and seeing this moment where Kiritsugu is at his lowest and that is where he needs to be put in order to realize that the thing he always should have been doing is saving lives, not taking them. He like his method of trying to save the world by killing people, it was never going to get him anywhere. And this, like, the true joy he feels at finally just being able to go into the rubble and dig this kid out of there and save this one boy's life, and how much salvation that gives him. And then, of course, you get Shido taking on the dream, right, that Kiritsugu tells him about being a hero, and this is the thing he wanted to be as a kid, but he was never able to be, and Shido takes it on. A fucking shaft of light from heaven shines down on Saber. I forgot about that detail in the Battle of Camlin. She looks up, and, like, the clouds start to part as Shido is saying that, like, I'll take up your dream for you, which is obviously, we will continue to see the adventures of these characters. But I am always bowled over by the ending of the show, and, like, the simplicity, but the power in Kiritsugu finally just saving this one kid, and how much that gives him.
It's beautiful and incredible. I love his final monologue in narration is, I never saw Ilya again, his daughter, but after Ilya, no other person was ever taken from me. I thought my life would be nothing but loss, but everyone is still here, just as when we met. And that little, like, to turn this tragedy into something of a happy ending for him because he breaks the cycle is so powerful. And again, as you say, even if there was no more, it's such a great ending. And I love the specific dialogue in his exchange with Shiro at the end there, where he, they're talking about being a hero and why he gave up this dream. And he says, you can only be a hero for so long. When you become an adult, it's much harder to call yourself one. I wish I had realized it sooner. And that is kind of the journey of Fate Zero, right? Is like this, the difficulty of actually calling someone or being a hero and what that idea represents. And then Shiro with this childlike kind of joy saying, well, since you couldn't be one, I'll do it. You missed your chance as an adult, but leave it to me. Leave me your dream. And I know from reading about Fate Stay Night that this is the moment where Kiritsugu passes away, essentially, right?
Yes.
And it's because it's not explicit in the show, but it is at the very least a symbolic, like, passing on, right?
He, his body has, like, been ravaged by the contents of the Grail and his crazy time magic. Obviously, like, he's, that classic anime character who uses the power that, like, is shortening his lifespan is very much that kind of thing. And so, yes, he says, the moon is beautiful. Then that whole thing with Shido and, like, I'll take up your dream. And then he says, Anshinsta, or, that's such a relief. And then he quietly passes away in that moment. It's the end of Kiritsugu.
And the end of an all-time great anime. So, Sean, where are we going next in the world of Fate Stay Night? Because I want to watch some more anime. Tell me what to watch.
Well, so next time on the show for Ufotable Moonworks, we are going to talk about Unlimited Blade Works, the TV adaptation. Make sure you're not watching the one weird movie they made. That's the Studio Dean one. Make sure you're watching the TV anime for Unlimited Blade Works. It is available on Crunchyroll just as Fate Zero was. We're going to be watching Season 1, which is Episode 0 to Episode 12. So that is what we'll be watching. It'll be very obvious, both Crunchyroll has it organized that way. It will be very clear what is the point of the end of Season 1. And it is not like Fate Zero, where you're in the middle of a giant fight and they're just like, fuck it, wait half a year, motherfuckers, to watch more. It is an easier ending spot. So I think it'll be fun to be able to take our time more with Fate Stay Night. But that is what we'll be watching next time.
Japanimation Station.